Upshot, Star Legend Book 7, written and narrated by J.J. Green. Part 1, Missing. Chapter 1. The slim silver rocket sat on its pad, silent and still. It was a miniature of the old models humankind had used to travel to the moon and then Mars long ago. 4 fins protruded at the base below the oxidizer and fuel sections, surmounted by a nose cone. The rocket was unmanned, though it did contain something that had once been a living human. Within the cone was a box that held the ashes from a cremation. The rocket had no particular destination. Its trajectory had been set only to avoid encounters with numerous orbiting satellites and the gravity wells of the Sun and the solar system's planets and moons. The small vessel would fly on for eternity, journeying through the black, perhaps grazing other star systems or passing through the tails of comets, speeding into and out of nebulae, until, in the end, the deceased's remains would leave the Milky Way and enter the wider universe. Millennia after his existence, perhaps the existence of humanity itself, was long forgotten. Talon sighed and shivered, though the evening was not cold. Funerals always made her uneasy. She'd seen too much death. She was also sick of listening to endless speeches. Dusk approached, and everyone and his brother seemed to want to tell their anecdotes. She hoped the current speaker would be the last. "Do you want my jacket?" Wright asked. "No thanks, I'm fine." The speaker was winding down, thank the stars. Kayla gave a loud sniff. Talon pulled her close. The speaker stepped from the podium. There was a pause. The crowd shuffled their feet and murmured. Was the countdown finally about to commence? But another figure appeared, walking up to give a speech. It was Hans Jonter, former Prime Minister of the Britannic Isles. She inwardly groaned. How typical of him to want to have his say and be the last to speak. The man loved the limelight, or perhaps he was only addicted to momentous events. If anything of public importance was happening, he had to be in the thick of it. "Lorcan ua Talman," he began, sweeping the assembled mourners with his gaze. He focused briefly on Talon before moving on. "The name conjures memories and images for everyone, does it not? Is there a single person on this planet who has not been impacted by his lifetime of work? Talman touched all of us, and though in his early years the effects were not always positive, I think we can all agree that his later actions more than made up for previous transgressions. He died one of the greatest and most well-loved figures of our time." Kayla sniffed again. Ever since the news had come of Lorcan's death from a sudden massive stroke, she had been wrapped in sorrow. It wasn't only Talman's passing affecting her. While they'd been away from Earth aboard the Defiant, 21 years had passed. Kayla's old school friends had moved on with their lives. The adult men and women had little in common with a 15-year-old. When she'd tried to reconnect, they'd been standoffish. Then Lorcan had died, and her remaining tie with the world she'd left behind had been severed. Wright said softly in Talon's ear, "We can leave straight after the ceremony. No need to stick around for the debriefing." He was referring to the post-launch reception. "Maybe. We'll see." If Kayla's mood didn't improve, perhaps leaving as soon as possible would be best, though it would have been nice to trade reminiscences with friends. Talon had spotted some familiar faces in the crowd, and it already felt like ages since the Defiant had touched down, though it had only been a few months. Jonter's speech was uncharacteristically brief. After he finished, there was a shift in the atmosphere. The select crowd of mourners, standing and seated, silently focused on the rocket through the protective barrier. The countdown began. The fuel ignited and flames roared from the rocket's base, vibrating the structure with propelling force. The gantry decoupled as the countdown reached 0, and the rocket rose smoothly into the air. Fighting gravity, it became a brilliant lozenge and then a speck of light, lost among the emerging stars. It was over. He was gone. Lorcan Uatalman had finally achieved his long-anticipated departure from Earth. With his passing, it seemed that one era was finished and a new one begun. Kayla elected to not go home immediately after the launch, saying, "Uncle Lorcan said sometimes life is very hard, but you mustn't let it get to you. You have to push through and try your best every day." The reception room was already filling by the time they reached it. Dignitaries had been allocated seats at the main table for a formal dinner, while less important attendees could sit at random tables and help themselves to a buffet spread. Talon, Wright and Kayla belonged to the latter category. A live band played background music, and a large screen overhanging the hall displayed scrolling images of Talman at all stages of his life, from a babe in his mother's arms to a dignified, imposing figure with his signature flaming red hair, and then a sprightly old man. Most touching were pictures of him with his wife and children. It was in those photos he looked happiest. Sadly, they had all died in a sinkhole tragedy in Antarctica. "Who's hungry?" Wright asked. "Kayla, do you want to come with me to get something to eat? Do you want anything, Talon?" "Not really. You two go ahead." She smiled wanly as he and her daughter headed for the buffet. Even in the most dire straits, Wright never lost his appetite, nor his capacity for comatose-like sleep, for that matter, though lately his nights had been the most disturbed she'd ever known them. "Hey," said a voice. "I thought I might see you here." "Iolani," Talon responded warmly, hugging the small woman. "How have you been?" She hadn't seen Iolani since they disembarked the Defiant. They'd become good friends on the long voyage. Iolani grimaced. "Not so good, if I'm honest. How about you?" "Why? What's wrong?" Talon didn't want to go over her own problems. It would only make her feel worse. Just the usual, I guess. It's hard to adjust after being away so long, right?" "Right. It's like coming back to an alien planet." The world had changed during their voyage. It was almost unrecognizable. The new understanding of physics gifted to humanity by a mysterious alien species had transformed everything. The environment, day-to-day life, human existence, in fact. The best way Talon had found to sum it up was that everything was simply better. Pollution had been entirely eradicated, and not only pollution of the air, soil and water, noise pollution had gone as well. Road vehicles whispered so quietly they would have been dangerous if it weren't for their capacity for instant emergency stops. Genetic screening of embryos and early diagnosis of psychological issues, and intervention and support for deprived families meant antisocial behavior had all but disappeared. Work was now optional because humanity could feed, house and care for everyone, regardless of their contribution. While in the past this would have led to addiction to drugs and escapist entertainment, now education focused on teaching children how to optimize their lives to be productive and satisfying. It was as near as you could get to a perfect society. Yet Talon was miserable. So was Kayla. And, though he never stated it, so was Wright. Iolani looked about to speak, but then she appeared to change her mind. To fill the slightly awkward silence, Talon asked, "Where are you living now?" "I went back to Suriname. No free accommodation on the Brez anymore." Iolani flashed a grin. "Were you sad you missed out on creating the habitats for Lorcan's fleet?" "Oh no. I expected it would have left by the time we got back. I gave the eco-engineers detailed instructions and advice. The biomes will operate well enough. The rainforest environment on the Defiant was a successful test run. It was beautiful. Thanks. I loved it. Reminded me of home. You and TJ should... Her words tailed away. We should what? Never mind. Here's the man himself. Wright had returned with Kayla, bearing full plates. Iolani and Wright exchanged pecks on cheeks. How have you been? He took a bite from a chicken drumstick. She shrugged. Oh, you know. How come you aren't in uniform? Don't you have to wear it for occasions like this? It's optional, but anyway, I resigned. My discharge papers arrived the other day. You left the Royal Marines? He gave a nervous chuckle. Is it such a big surprise? Shooting Talon a glance, he went on. It was always the plan once the Defiant's mission was over. I served for 18 years, or a lot longer if you count time as it passed here. Unfortunately, the pensions department doesn't, but I think I did my part. Oh, absolutely. No one could say you didn't do more than enough. I'm just finding it hard to wrap my head around you becoming a civilian. What are you going to do? Haven't decided yet. Ma'am! Talon had stolen a chip from Kayla's plate. It's one chip. Get your own! Talon rolled her eyes. Shall we find somewhere to sit down? I'm going to need a drink to get through this. More people had begun to arrive, and the crowd was growing thicker and noisier. Sure, said Iolani. I heard the wine is vintage. I want to try some. Lorcan didn't spare any expense for his send-off, did he? Kakoa is here somewhere. You look for a table and I'll find her. We can go over old times. Several drinks later, Iolani was flushed and everyone was relaxed and chatty. Kayla had left the table to add her memories of Tauman to the store of recordings being created. Kakoa nudged Iolani in the ribs. You should tell them about the time Lorcan kidnapped you. He what? Exclaimed Talon, sitting up. Are you kidding? Now's not the moment, said Iolani. Not at his funeral for Star's sake. Besides, he reformed. We should remember him for the good he did. Wright put down his glass and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He kidnapped you? I'm sorry, Talon said. I'm all for not speaking ill of the dead, but you can't mention something like that and not follow through. Yeah, said Wright. Don't leave us hanging. Iolani tutted and frowned at her partner. You shouldn't have said anything. Well, I did. I'll tell them if you like, though I only remember it from my end of events. I don't think you've ever explained exactly what happened to you. That's because I don't want to go over it. But now you've brought it up. Iolani proceeded to tell them a bizarre tale about Tauman visiting her at her mountain research station, the two of them getting into an argument, and Tauman subsequently trapping and drugging her before taking her back with him to the Brez. Kakoa interjected, You can imagine how the rest of us felt when we realized what he'd done, but no one dared say anything. He was so scary back then. It wasn't even simply about losing our jobs. He could and did ruin people's lives. Sounds like he changed a lot, Talon commented. He was always generous and kind to me and the kids. He was generous in death too, said Kakoa. Iolani and I will never have to work again, and I'm guessing you two are the same? Talon and Wright nodded. Talon said, Kayla is set up for life too, though I haven't told her yet. He was a complicated man, said Iolani. Do you know his heart isn't among the ashes? He had it buried next to his wife and children's graves in Antarctica. I didn't. That's so touching. I don't think he wanted it made public knowledge. The graves and memorial site are going to be closed to the general public next year and not maintained anymore. Lorcan wanted the world to move on after his death. The mood took a downturn. Perhaps the others felt as Talon did, that the world had moved on for them too, leaving them behind. Her sense of displacement and alienation had built for months, along with confusion and unhappiness. Caris, her adopted daughter, had left with Talman's fleet long before the Defiant's return. Her parting message had been hurtfully brief and impersonal. Talon didn't know if she would ever get over the pain she'd felt when reading it, or the loss of the girl. She would never see her again, and Caris would never experience the rich pleasures of existence on New Earth, as some had taken to calling it. She'd swapped an easy, enjoyable life for the uncertainty and dangers of deep space colonization. Why? Talon would never know. The absence of Caris made the days feel pale and incomplete, and Talon had another deep unhappiness she couldn't even bring herself to face. Krakoa said, "Now you two have all the free time in the world, you should come and stay with us for a while." Iolani seemed annoyed, and Talon had the impression from the look that passed between them that she'd nudged Krakoa under the table. "You're very welcome, but maybe later on, after we fix things up a little." "Did you tell them about the weird stuff happening on the mountain?" Krakoa piped brightly. "I don't really want to talk about it." "The mountain?" Wright asked. "Where we live," Krakoa explained. "Iolani's old house is there, and we've been renovating it. The jungle wasn't slow at reclaiming the place, but we're making headway. Or at least, we were." She looked at her partner, who had averted her gaze. "Should I show them the pictures? It isn't going to hurt, surely." "I guess it's okay." Iolani gave an apologetic look. "You guys are like us, trying to get back to normal, right? Only nothing's normal anymore. I don't want to burden you with more bullshit." "It's no problem," said Talon. "I'm interested to hear about it." In truth, any distraction was welcome. Krakoa pulled a small interface from her bag and placed its screen upward. At a word of instruction, the interface projected a hollow about 30 centimeters high of an animal's skull. Curved canines hung down from the upper jaw, and large eye holes stared. The skull was fresh and bloody. "Whoa!" Talon reared back. Quickly checking around, she said, "I'm glad Kayla isn't here." "Sorry." Krakoa issued another instruction, and the skull was replaced by a rope of colorful beads hanging from a tree branch. "I didn't realize the skull would come up first. That's the worst pick in the file. The really bad ones are somewhere else." "There are worse things than the skull?" asked Wright. Iolani sighed. "We've been coming across things like that all over the place, along tracks, next to streams, and even deep in the forest where hardly anyone ever goes. Skulls and bones, blood wiped on leaves, dolls made from bark and feathers, butterflies impaled on thorns, beetles threaded on animal gut." "That's what that is?" asked Talon, viewing the beads with new eyes. She took a swig of wine. Iolani turned to Krakoa. "I don't think they need to see any more." Her partner turned off the hollow and returned the interface to her bag. "Iolani lived in that part of the mountain for years, and it's the first time she's ever seen anything like it. It is very unusual. I don't know what to make of it. Should we be scared and move out? I'd hate to do that. I love it up there. On the other hand, I don't want to stick around if we might be in danger." Wright asked, "Does it seem like this stuff is targeted at you?" "We haven't seen anything close to home," replied Krakoa, "and we can't figure out a pattern. The sites appear to be random." "Then maybe you just have a nutter living locally," said Talon. "Someone the authorities don't know about yet. Have you told anyone what you've seen?" Iolani grimaced. "Things aren't as well set up in Suriname as they are in most places. The modern revolution has passed the country by to a large extent. We can't rely on the authorities to do anything about what we've been seeing, especially not way up in the mountains. They don't want to leave their comfortable environment-controlled offices. Besides, nothing actually illegal has taken place as far as we know. It's just concerning behaviour." "Shit," said Talon. "I don't know what to suggest. That sounds awful." "It is awful," Iolani agreed. "It was a bad idea to bring it up. Let's talk about something else." But the vibe didn't recover after the revelation. A pall seemed to hang over the four companions. When Kayla returned to the table, she noticed it immediately. Looking from face to face, she said, "I would ask who died, but I already know." "Maybe it's time we headed home," suggested Wright. "It's been a long day." Talon quickly agreed. Kakoa and Iolani appeared to be ready to leave too. With vague promises to meet up again soon, they departed. Taking one of the small, neat autocars waiting outside, Talon, Wright and Kayla settled in for the journey home. The quiet, somber, post-funeral mood continued until Kayla said, "Ma'am, I got talking to another girl at the reception. She goes to a private boarding school in Scotland. It sounds amazing. They do all kinds of things, archery, horse riding, hiking, and they learn cool stuff like gene splicing. I know you want me to go back to my old school, but it isn't going to be the same now all my friends have left. Do you think I could go to the boarding school in Scotland?" Talon's heart sank. The last thing she wanted was to lose the last of her children. Perhaps sensing her feelings, Wright replied for her, "Maybe you can find out some more about it first. It sounds like something to think about." "Okay," said Kayla, returning her gaze to the darkness beyond the car windows. Talon looked outside too. Nothing was visible except the lamps lighting the road, but she recalled the wild meadows they'd passed on their journey to the launch site. The scenery was wonderful. Free energy meant that most food was grown underground in vast subterranean fields. All over the globe, the land was returning to its natural state. Woodlands and forests were sprouting up everywhere, and animal life was booming. The world was beautiful, and yet she could find no pleasure in it. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "If that's what you really want, Kayla, you should do it." Chapter 2. Kayla left for her new school in September. Talon tried not to be too emotional as she said goodbye, but she didn't succeed. The parting brought back so many bad memories of searching for her children while the world had been at war. Separating from her daughter again challenged the very fibre of her being. Though it was irrational, she couldn't shake the feeling she was seeing Kayla for the last time. When it was over, she and Wright journeyed back to West BI. After arriving at the empty house, she went straight to bed, but endured many hours of wakefulness, contemplating the empty future, before finally falling into a restless sleep. It was early morning when she awoke, not feeling remotely refreshed. Wright, unusually, was already awake. He draped an arm over her and pulled her close, kissing her cheek. "Do you fancy going for a run?" "Yeah, why not? I was thinking we could go to your favourite walk on the coast." He meant the place where he'd proposed 21 years ago, Earth time. All right. He was being his usual kind, considerate self, trying to take her mind off things and make her feel better. She doubted a run in a nice spot was going to help, but she appreciated the gesture. She dressed mechanically, wondering to herself if there was any point in keeping in shape anymore. It made sense when there had been things to do and enemies to fight, but what did physical fitness matter now? When they arrived, a stiff breeze was blowing across the cliff top, salt-laden, moist and warm. Summer was clinging on in the Britannic Isles. The sun was just rising, chasing night from the western sky, where only the brightest stars faintly glimmered. From the cliff edge inland, no one and nothing was to be seen except turf and low, tough shrubs leaning away from the sea. Talon and Wright set off. Before running even a kilometre, she was panting and coated in sweat. It was hard to stay fit in space, and her time on the Defiant had taken its toll. They covered another kilometre and then another, while the sun slowly rose. The exercise wasn't having its usual effect. Rather than alleviating her heavy-heartedness, it seemed to be making it worse. Perhaps it was because here Wright had surprised her with his proposal. Life had seemed perfect then. Her family had been complete, the war long over, and the future appeared rosy. Now she collapsed, dropping to the trail mid-step. Her impetus carried her forward onto her elbows, and her forehead hit the ground. Sobs welled up. Her chest heaved, and her shoulders shook as a tidal wave of emotion spilled out. Talon! Wright was at her side. Dimly, she felt his arm around her, pulling her against him. Then she knew little of time passing, only the vague comfort of another human body, the warm wind and the rhythmic crash of waves on rocks far below. Eventually Wright said, "It's Patrin, isn't it?" She nodded. Ever since leaving her son at the jousting list on a far-distant alien planet, she hadn't truly faced the inevitable consequence of his decision. Merlin and Morgan had asked him to remain behind when the Defiant departed. In return, they had conjured the dead personnel back to life and agreed to cease interfering in humanity's affairs. They had been true to their word. Everyone had returned to the ship except the chosen four, Patrin, Arthur, and Carla and Perrin Orr. The Defiant had flown back to Earth without incident, and the skein mappers had reported no further external influences on human society. There had been no time for a proper goodbye, but Patrin had been sanguine. He hadn't really understood what he'd agreed to, despite Talon's attempts at explanation. Arthur knew. His expression had been grave, yet he hadn't tried to dissuade the boy. Perhaps as a king who had dedicated himself to serving his people, he accepted the gesture of sacrifice. Faced with the impossible choice, so had Talon. Yet she could not trust the aliens to send Patrin home as they'd promised. They might do it eventually, but their concept of time was skewed by their extreme longevity, perhaps immortality. Also, Morgan and Merlin enjoyed playing with human emotions. If they did comprehend the relatively vast period that would pass for Talon as she waited, the idea of her spending decades pining for her child would tickle them. She might never see Patrin again. It was a fact she had been trying to ignore since their brief farewell. She could never see her son again. She had only just been able to admit it. He might. Don't say it! Please, don't say it! She didn't want him to spark a ray of hope in her heart. How could she live every day waiting, watching, looking for a sign that Patrin might be back? What kind of life would that be? She couldn't live on dreams, yet she also couldn't live with the knowledge that he was gone forever. I'm sorry. Sorry for what? That you aren't enough. Talon, I never expected to be. Some time later, they got to their feet and began the walk back to the car park, hand in hand. She felt numb. Tomorrow stood out in her mind as a mountain to climb, and the day after that, every day would be the same. The days would melt to weeks, months, and years, all containing a giant gaping hole. She would not live her life, she would endure it. Neither of them had thought to order an autocar as they walked back, so they had to wait for one. As they stood in the car park, Wright said, "Why don't we go and visit Iolani and Kakoa in Suriname? It would be a change of scenery and might help take your mind off things." She shrugged. "If you like. We can go by airship. No need to hurry. Kayla won't be back until Christmas." Chapter 3. The mountains of Suriname spread out below, steep slopes cloaked in deep green, tendrils of cloud wreathing their peaks. As the airship approached a valley, it began to descend, drifting gracefully down from the heights. The engine noise was a mere murmur against the background sigh of gentle winds. The valley floor widened, and a few low buildings came into view. Here was the stopping point of their 2-week journey, and it was here Iolani and Cocoa would meet them as prearranged. They'd been forced to make the arrangements before they set off. One of the features of the voyage was lack of connectivity to the net. The passengers were supposed to relax and free their minds of worldly cares, and being unable to contact the outside world was part of that. Unfortunately, Talon's worries had little to do with the affairs on Earth. Her concerns aside, the trip had been magnificent. Floating across the Atlantic, they had seen scores of whales, dolphins, the vast Sargasso Sea, flocks of migrating birds, stunning cloudscapes, breathtaking sunrises and sunsets, and at night thousands of brilliant stars reflected in the dark ocean. At several points the airship had drawn to a slow halt and lowered viewing capsules into the water, offering glimpses of life beneath the waves. The meals had been delicious. Some included ingredients she'd never even heard of. Outside of mealtimes, the passengers read, listened to music, danced, exercised their artistic talents, or simply watched the view and chatted. If only she could have appreciated the experience. Intellectually she did, but she could not feel it. All she felt was a hollow dullness, and as the cruise liner of the sky sailed closer to the ground, she feared this holiday visiting Iolani and Cocoa wouldn't change how she felt, that she would have to put on a show so as not to spoil the atmosphere. They were watching from their balcony as the airship descended. As if sensing her thoughts, Wright put an arm around her. "Let's just see how it works out. If we aren't having fun, we can make our excuses and leave. They'll understand. There won't be any hard feelings." A question that had burned in her mind for a long time surfaced. In her misery she asked it, prodding old scars. "You know when you and Iolani were on the Dauntless, did you have a thing going on? When Talon had refused to go on the mission, and she and Wright had parted ways, neither knowing if they would see the other again. He had told her not to wait for him, yet she had waited. Had he waited for her? He was watching her from the corners of his eyes. "What makes you think that?" "Nothing in particular. Did you?" He pulled her closer. "No, Iolani and I did not have a thing going on." She sensed there was more than he was telling her, but she didn't push it. There were some things it was better to not know. The gondola hung 50 meters off the ground. A grassy expanse awaited it, along with 10 or 12 men in red and white striped t-shirts and denim jeans. A shout went out from the ship, and coils of rope unfurled until they dangled at full length. "They aren't going to pull us down, are they?" Talon asked. "Only the last 20 meters or so. It's part of the experience." In other circumstances she might have chuckled. Naturally, the airship could land perfectly safely under its own steam, but men dressed like fairground roustabouts hauling it in was more quaint and charming. A man leapt and caught the end of a rope, and in a minute all of them were pulling hand over hand. The gondola kissed the grass, and its descent came to an almost imperceptible halt. The men tied the ropes to pilings with a flourish. The journey was over. It was time to disembark. Talon and Wright picked up their suitcases and walked out into the sunshine. Tropical, moist air, tinged with floral scents, enveloped them. An automated transport awaited to take the luggage to the arrivals terminal. After depositing her suitcase, Talon took a final look at the immense balloon that had carried them across the ocean, swaying in the breeze, before setting off with Wright across the field. Environmental controls within the arrivals hall provided short-lived relief from the heat and humidity, and then they were outside again, officially checked into Suriname. I thought Iolani and Cocoa would wait for us inside, Talon commented as they stepped into the sunshine. A few tour operators and hawkers had been awaiting the airship passengers. Wright was scanning up and down the road that ran across the front of the building. I thought so too, or they would at least be out here. 4 autocars sat in a bay, and they were quickly taken. Other passengers had gone with the tour operators in their minivans. Only Talon and Wright had no one to meet them and no transportation. I'm sure I told them the correct date and time, but with the comm blackout on the airship it wasn't possible to confirm. Something's made them a bit late, that's all. Talon scanned the greenery spreading out all around. Beyond the road, the ground dipped into a wide basin thick with trees. The basin was so deep the canopies were level with her eyeline. The jungle ran up the slopes and then rose higher into mountains in the distance. In the Britannic Isles and many other places in the world, wild plants and animals were reclaiming the land, but here she had a sense they had never departed. Travelling around this place can't be easy. The airship port was far from the capital and smaller cities and towns, deliberately so, in order to fit in with the escape from the hustle and bustle experience. By coincidence, it also happened to be near the mountain where Iolani and Cocoa lived. Wright fished in his pocket, brought out an earcom and popped it in. It's working. What's that? She'd heard the distant whine of an engine from somewhere high up. She searched the skies. It was too soon for the airship to be departing. The noise had been different too. There it is. Wright pointed a little south of the sun. She squinted. A small heli was approaching. Do you think it's them? What a novel way to pick us up. Probably the most convenient, considering the terrain. The heli swooped overhead and descended rapidly and rather jerkily, landing in the same field as the airship. Do you think it's going to be safe travelling in that thing? Whoever was flying it, their piloting skills left something to be desired. Wright didn't answer. Picking up their suitcases, he said, "If it is them, we can meet them inside." Iolani burst through the double doors on the immigration and customs side of the arrivals hall. Spotting them, she beckoned frantically, her eyes wide and her face flushed. As they got close, she said, "I'm sorry I'm late, but something terrible has happened. I almost forgot you were coming today. This way, quickly." She disappeared through the doors. Raising her eyebrows at Wright, Talon followed Iolani into the now deserted passenger processing section. "Are you sure this is okay?" Wright asked Iolani's back as she hurriedly led them to the field. What they were doing seemed odd to Talon too. Surely there were security prohibitions. Iolani gave them a quick glance. "You'll find things are a bit different here. Slacker. Don't worry, no one cares." She passed through the exterior doors running. Then she ran to the heli. By the time Talon and Wright reached it, she had already started it up, and the blades were lazily swinging around. It wasn't until Talon had climbed into a seat that she realized someone was missing. "Where's Cocoa?" As if she'd been shot, Iolani collapsed. She hunched over, her face in her hands. "She's gone! I think she might have been kidnapped. That's why I was late picking you up. I've been looking." Her sobs overcame her ability to speak, and she huffed, her chest heaving. Talon, sitting next to her, put a hand on her shoulder. "Take your time." Sharing a surprised and concerned look with Wright, she added, "Don't worry, we'll help you find her. It might not be anything serious. She might only be lost or—" "She isn't lost! She's walked the trails around my house hundreds of times." Iolani leaned back in her seat and took a deep breath. It's possible she only had an accident. That's what I keep telling myself. Something bad enough to disable her and stop her from contacting me, but not so bad she's in real danger.
Have you contacted the rescue services? Asked Wright.
There are no rescue services.
What about the police?
It doesn't work like that around here. Iolani took another deep breath and appeared to assert some control over her emotions. I'll take you home. You'll understand better when we get there. She manipulated the controls. The rotor blades whirred to a blur, and the heli lifted into the sky. Talon watched the ground fall away with some concern. She was worried about Cocoa, but also about Iolani, who was not in a fit state to be piloting anything. Raising her voice over the noise of the engine and blades, she asked, "This doesn't fly on automatic?" "There's no net for air vehicles, only ground. You have to understand, the tech revolution hasn't reached most of Suriname. The topography, climate and low population work against development. In many ways, this place is the same as it's always been." The tree canopy sped past beneath them. A mountain approached, and Iolani took them high up its slope. All the while, Talon hadn't seen any roads since leaving the airship port, though she guessed there had to be trails invisible from above. Iolani had said Cocoa knew the ones around her house. The heli moved close to the mountain. A flat roof appeared amidst the vegetation, orange and easily visible within the green. A white cross marked the center. "Buying this heli was one of the first things I did after I got home," Iolani commented as she lowered the aircraft to the landing spot. "I'm so glad I did. It used to be a nightmare to get down the mountain and bring back supplies. This makes everything much easier. It was Cocoa's idea." She trembled, and the heli wavered as it hit the pad.
"Take it easy,"
said Wright from the back seat. She turned off the engine. "I'm okay. It's going to be okay," she added, as if talking to herself. "There has to be a simple explanation for why she's gone missing, right?"
"Right," Talon said. Iolani attached the heli to tethers and then led them down an outside staircase. Dogs could be heard barking within the house, no doubt understanding their mistress had returned. Talon walked with her and Wright around to the front. A veranda protruded from it, closed in by mosquito netting. It held a hammock and 2 reclining chairs. Traces of vines once covering the walls remained, and the vegetation in the yard looked as though it had been hacked by machetes. The jungle had indeed tried to reclaim this place, but the 2 women had been hard at work taking it back. The home was a picture of human domesticity, deep within the heart of nature. Except there was something red and weirdly shaped attached to the front door. Iolani drew to an abrupt halt and began to breathe heavily. The veranda door hung open. "What is that thing?" Talon asked. Iolani didn't answer. She seemed transfixed. Talon slowly climbed the steps. Now she could see the object more clearly. She also froze. It was a skull, bloody, with shreds of flesh and hair still clinging to it. The lower jaw was missing, and the sightless eye socket stared, boring into her soul. Chapter 4. "It isn't human," said Wright. He'd walked past Talon and up to the door. "I'm sure it isn't. It's too small." Iolani broke from her paralysis. She slowly climbed the stairs, her hand shaking as it glided up the banister rail. When she reached Wright's side, she peered up at the skull, which hung at the height of his head. Talon still couldn't move. A single drop of blood fell from the horrible object and hit the planks below, joining other splatters. The skull must have been placed recently. She forced herself to turn and search the shadows beneath the trees, but she saw only darkness.
Whoever had brought the skull here had either left or was standing still and in silence, waiting for a reaction.
"You're right," Iolani breathed. "It's from a monkey. Shit, I thought."
"I feared the same," said Talon. "Thank the stars we were wrong." Wright was inspecting the skull closely. "It's fresh. Someone's only just put it here." He made a move toward the outer door. "No, stay here." Talon touched his arm. "We don't know how many of them there are." The pictures Cocoa had shown them at Lorcan's memorial reception were flashing back. Animal heads, necklaces made from dead insects. There was no question in her mind these were linked to Cocoa's disappearance and the skull on the door. Inside the house the dogs were going crazy, barking, whining and scratching at the door. Iolani reached up and gingerly prodded the skull.
"My dogs must be able to smell it, and they'll be on alert from a stranger being here. Can you wait a moment? I'll go in and calm them down."
She slipped inside. "Poor Cocoa," Talon murmured. "I hope she's okay." "Iolani needs to contact the police," Wright said. "I can't believe they wouldn't do something about this, even here." Talon shrugged. "She must know what she's talking about." A few moments later, Iolani reappeared, smiling tightly.
"The dogs want to say hello. Lorcan and Talman are boisterous, but they won't hurt you. They'll understand you're my friends."
"Lorcan and Talman?" Talon asked.
"He was the scariest person I knew. For a while, I couldn't resist naming them after him."
She opened the door. 2 large, black, short-haired hounds bounded out. The first place they went was the skull, but Iolani ordered them away. Next they sniffed Talon and Wright thoroughly, though they were sufficiently well disciplined to not jump up. The head of the tallest one reached Talon's waist. She didn't know their breed and speculated they weren't purebred. Iolani must have chosen them for their ability to intimidate, which they had in spades.
"Cocoa usually takes them with her when she goes for a walk. She didn't today. They ate something they shouldn't have in the forest, and they were suffering the repercussions all night. If only they'd gone with her."
"Let's go in," said Talon. Iolani's home had a natural simplicity to it that, having come to know her well during the Defiant's voyage, Talon would have expected. It was compact, too. The main area combined kitchen, living and dining room. The furnishings were plain but good quality, and fresh tropical flowers were the principal decorations.
"Sit down," Iolani said. "You must be tired after—"
"You need to contact the police," Wright interrupted. "Now. Whoever put that skull on your door won't be far away. If they hurry, they might still catch them and find out what's happened to Cocoa." Iolani's shoulders slumped.
"I suppose it's the only thing I can do, but it won't do any good. You'll see."
She left through one of the inner doors. "I don't get it," Wright said. "In any other place in the world, contacting the authorities would be the automatic action if a loved one went missing. Why is she so reluctant?" "I guess she knows how things operate here better than us." "Then what else is there? I mean, we can look, but our chances of finding Cocoa without outside help are next to nothing." "I wish Arthur was here," Talon ruminated. "He can read a trail like no one's business." "I wish we had guns." Iolani returned, looking even more forlorn.
"They're on their way. They should arrive in a couple of hours."
2 hours? Wright echoed.
"As I keep telling you,"
Iolani said with uncharacteristic vehemence.
"Things work differently in this country. Besides, the police have to bike up the mountain. They don't have air transport."
"Can't you collect them in your heli?" Talon asked. Iolani turned despairing eyes to her.
"They would refuse. It would be an insult to them. They would take it as an implication they couldn't do their job. If I offered, they would be even less inclined to help me."
"That's insane," said Wright.
"I agree. It doesn't change anything.
She sighed and sank down into a seat. The dogs circled and then plonked themselves on the floor at her feet, glancing up adoringly. "Please, sit down." When Talon and Wright complied, she went on, "It's partly to do with my rep. When I lived here before, I was the mad woman who lives on the mountain. The local people didn't know about the work I was doing, or if they did know, they didn't understand or appreciate it. Living up here when you have the option to live in the city in a nice modern house with access to all the amenities is crazy. Only the very poor or very stupid do it. I don't know which they thought I was, but most people I dealt with treated me with condescension or contempt." She smiled wanly. "To the locals, I wasn't a world-renowned scientist doing vital research to help save the planet. I was a weirdo, a moronic hermit, and my reputation has stuck. Even now, decades after I left, they still see me the same way, though now their feelings about me are also riddled with deep suspicion. How did I stay young for so long? Am I the daughter of the previous madwoman? I get questions like that whenever I show my face in town. I could hear the suspicion and disbelief in the dispatcher's voice just now when I explained the situation. The police will come, but they won't hurry. They most likely believe I'm making it all up for attention. And, regardless, they're generally so incompetent they wouldn't be able to help anyway." She stood up. "We're going to be waiting a while. Let me get you a drink." "Iolani," said Talon, "the love of your life is missing, and you have maniacs attaching monkey skulls to your door. You don't need to be the gracious host." "You're right." Her chin trembled. "I know you're right, but I don't know what else to do." "I'm going into the forest," Wright announced. "If we wait 2 hours, whoever's doing this will be long gone." "But they're dangerous," said Talon. "And you aren't armed. Anything could happen." "We can't sit by and do nothing." "All right, but you shouldn't go alone, and I don't think we should leave Iolani by herself." "Then stay with her. You know I can look after myself." "You don't know. Lorcan and Talman will protect me," said Iolani. "There's no need to worry. That's why whoever's taken Cocoa waited until she was alone."
"Wait," Wright said. "Did you try sending the dogs out to find her?"
"It was the first thing I did, but they got halfway down the main track and began sneezing. Then they wandered around as if they were confused."
"Sneezing? Do you think someone put something down to mask Cocoa's scent trail?"
"It's possible, but there's a lot of weird stuff out there too. Besides, Lorcan and Talman aren't trained to follow scents. I'm not sure they knew what they were doing."
"Okay," said Talon decisively, rising to her feet. "I'm coming too."
Chapter 5. They checked they were in full comm contact before leaving. Even in Suriname, comms worked effectively. The fact eased Talon's concerns about Iolani being alone, albeit with 2 massive hounds between her and potential attackers.
"Those dogs, huh?"
Wright remarked as they crossed the open patch of ground in front of Iolani's house. "I was just thinking about them too. Lorcan and Talman?" She chuckled, but then the seriousness of the situation hit. "Do you have any ideas on what might be going on?" He halted at the edge of the jungle.
"What Iolani said about her reputation makes me wonder if this is intended to get her and Cocoa to leave. Maybe they'll release Cocoa soon, now they've given her a fright."
"I hope that's all it is. I certainly wouldn't want to stick around here after everything that's happened." They stepped under the canopy. There was a clear track leading away from the house, which they followed. The heat and humidity quickly closed in, and the air buzzed with insect life. As Talon became coated in sweat, she too questioned the wisdom of living in this inhospitable, isolated, lonely place. The cool climate of West BI was far preferable. A second, narrower track led away from the first.
They decided to take it, reasoning the kidnappers wouldn't want to stay on the main path. The ground had been sloping downward ever since they'd entered the forest, and in this section the incline was steeper. They were soon grasping vines and tree roots for safety. A third track appeared. It was little more than a trace of slightly clearer ground. In her previous life, Talon might not have even noticed it, but accompanying Arthur on journeys through wild places had taught her to be more observant. Wright agreed it was worth a closer look, and they took it. As they descended, the sounds of jungle life had been growing louder. Rustling in the undergrowth and high in tree branches, the calls of birds and perhaps other things, the flash of a disappearing reptilian tail. But there was no sign of human activity, current or recent. Maybe they didn't come this way, said Talon. Iolani mentioned that Kokoa knew all the trails around the house, so there must be lots of them. We're only 20 minutes out. Let's go a little far. Ah! He'd slipped. Wright slid away down the moist slope before Talon could grab him. He fell meters, bumping against roots and protruding nodules of ground, reaching for but failing to grab anything that might stop his descent. Talon looked on in horror, unable to help. He disappeared from sight. She called after him, rapidly climbing down the track and nearly falling too. Then the sounds of his progress stopped. Wright, are you okay? Where are you? Oh shit. Wright, what's happening? He didn't answer. She could hear him moving, however, and headed toward the sound. I'm down here, he finally said. Be careful, it's really steep. Actually, it's better you don't come down. I'll climb back up. Wait there, I'm coming. She still couldn't see him, but she could guess where he was. The faint trail they'd been following had been made clearer by his passage. Bruised foliage, bent stems, and patches where the moss had been scraped away, revealing the almost black earthy leaf mould, marked the path. Talon, stay where you are. You don't want to see this. I don't want to see what? I thought you weren't hurt. I'm not, except I'm going to have some spectacular bruises. But I found something, and it isn't nice. She could see him now. He'd reached a level piece of ground and was sitting in the hollow at the base of a huge tree root snaking over the path. He was side on to her and was looking at something, but he seemed to hear her approach and looked up. I told you to stay where you were. You know how good I am at following orders, and besides, you're not my CO anymore, Major Wright. He'd been promoted, but Major Wright was her go-to tease. He was covered in mud and green streaks of moss, and also... Is that blood? Stars, you are hurt. I'm not. It isn't mine. Come on down then, since you insist. She descended the track. What she hadn't been able to see from above, what he'd tried to keep her from seeing, was the body of a dead monkey, or more like a gibbon or baboon. It was draped over the root as if casually tossed aside. The corpse had been decapitated. She drew in a breath. Wright was looking at her with his "I told you so" expression. You fell onto it? Yes. So it's the monkey's blood? Not yours? Yes. She swallowed. Well, we know they came this way. We do. He clambered upright, using the tree trunk for support. We should leave it for the police. I think the kidnappers probably killed the animal here and then cut off its head to carry it to the house. Let's look around some more. Do you think they came back this way? Who knows? But even if they are nearby, I doubt they would try anything. Kokoa's small, like Iolani. You don't have to be brave to snatch a small, weak woman out by herself. As they continued downward, the sound of running water supplemented the noises of the forest. They came upon the source quite suddenly. A fast-running stream crossed their path.
A log had been placed across it, but the log was wet and slimy and seemed extremely likely to aid passage into the water rather than over it. Beyond the stream, the jungle grew even thicker, and the track appeared to entirely fail. As they debated whether to attempt a crossing, a comm request arrived for Talon. It was Iolani. "The police are here, but you said it would take them a couple of hours. I thought about it and decided to offer to fly them up anyway. They accepted, surprisingly. The chief of police came along too, so he must be taking it seriously. I guess I'm less notorious and more famous than I thought." "You must be. We'll be there soon. We found something they'll be interested to hear about." She and Wright began the climb back. The local chief of police was a tall man in his 50s, well-muscled but running a little to fat. He grasped Talon's hand tightly as he introduced himself and stared fixedly into her eyes. She stared back, unfazed by the power play. According to Iolani, his force wasn't that great at its job. She would decide whether Chief Moen deserved her respect when she'd seen him in action. He turned to Wright, offering his hand. "And you must be Lieutenant Colonel Wright." No." Wright frowned. "I'm no longer with the Royal Marines. You can call me TJ." He looked questioningly at Iolani, but she shrugged. "Ms. Hale didn't reveal your identity," Chief Moen explained. "Everyone knows about the famous Lieutenant Colonel Wright of the Defiant, who led the team that freed Earth from alien control." Wright seemed even more puzzled, and so was Talon. How did he know who Wright was? What was more, if anyone could be said to have led the team, it was Fleet Admiral Yorkson. At least as far as the public were aware that was the case. In reality, Yorkson had been at a loss when it came to the battle on the alien planet. A Batcher had thought up the tactics, and it had been Patrin who had defeated Merlin in the joust. Perhaps Moen knew Wright from the airship manifest. They'd had to state where they were staying when passing through immigration control, and the chief had put two and two together. In some ways, the local police weren't as inefficient as Iolani thought. Talon hoped her husband's apparent fame would spur Chief Moen to do his best to find Kokoa. Iolani had put her dogs in another room. She looked overwhelmed and near tears. Whines, scratches, and other occasional sounds of canine dissatisfaction leaked out from behind the closed door. The chief had brought 3 subordinates with him, 2 of whom were inspecting the monkey skull, their hands encased in latex gloves. "We found the rest of that in the forest," Talon said, gesturing at the skull. "Or rather, Lieutenant Colonel Wright did." Wright threw her a withering look. "I fell onto it, unfortunately. We left it where we found it." "Interesting," said Moen. "You remember where it is?" "Certainly. I'll conduct a coordinated search. If it weren't for the monkey skull, I would suspect this was just another case of an unwary hiker getting lost or getting themselves into trouble. But there may be something else going on." "No shit," Talon muttered, louder than she'd intended, drawing the gazes of everyone in the room. She gave a small cough. Wright rolled his eyes. "First," said Moen, "I'd like to take a look at the monkey's body, if you wouldn't mind, TJ." "I'll stay here with Iolani," Talon announced. Wright and Moen left, the 3 officers accompanying them. They'd put the monkey skull into an evidence bag and then inside a cooler. Iolani placed the cooler on the veranda, closed the door, and then let her dogs out. Talon made her sit down while she prepared drinks for both of them in the small kitchen. Iolani was weeping by the time she returned, carrying their glasses. Lorcan and Tauman had rested their heads on her knees and were watching her mournfully. "I can't help thinking I'll never see her again," Iolani said between sobs. "Whoever's done this is probably only trying to scare you and Kokoa. Don't give up hope. Is there any reason someone might want you to move out?" Iolani sniffed. Not that I can think of. Believe me, I've done a lot of thinking, trying to figure out who it might be and why they're targeting Cocoa and me. But I can't come up with anything. We literally have no face-to-face contact with anyone except shopkeepers in town. All our other contacts are online. And though this area is beautiful, it has no practical value. It's too wild and inaccessible for tourists, and the days of exploiting mineral deposits on Earth are over. I don't see why anyone would want to force us to leave. Talon was stumped too. The only possible conclusion seemed to be that Cocoa's kidnappers were nutters, pure and simple. If she was right, there was no telling what they might have done. Later, when Wright and Chief Moen returned, they brought the monkey's body with them. The sight of it sent Iolani into a fresh fit of fear and unhappiness. Moen seemed to anticipate a second, longer search, asking her if he and his officers could stay at the house overnight, if necessary. His expectation made sense, considering Iolani had already searched everywhere nearby and the nature of the terrain. She told him she had camping equipment they could borrow to sleep in the front yard. Wright told Talon, "We found some more of the weird stuff Cocoa and Iolani told us about before." "Like what?" He stepped away from Iolani, taking Talon with him, before saying quietly, "There was the flayed body of some kind of rodent hanging from a branch with feathers stuck in it. It was awful. And someone had painted symbols on a tree trunk in blood." "What sort of symbols?" "Not anything I recognized." Moen was briefing the search team, dividing up the ground and allocating sections. It was now mid-afternoon, with only 3 or 4 hours of daylight remaining. Talon glanced at Iolani. "I think I should stay here while the search is going on."
"I agree. Iolani shouldn't be on her own at a time like this. I'm going to join the team."
"Be careful." She hugged him, mud, moss, blood and dirt notwithstanding. Soon the sounds of searchers were quickly dissipating as they walked into the forest. While Talon waited with Iolani, she tried to distract her from her worries, but it was impossible. Iolani was constantly on edge, listening minute by minute for news via her comm, but no news came. The dogs grew restless, and Iolani explained it was their dinner time. She fed them, and afterward Talon helped her take tents out of storage and put them up, hoping they would not be needed. Twilight fell, and the searchers didn't return. Their tents remained empty in the yard. The forest was dark and silent, save for the sounds of the wildlife. When dusk arrived, there was still no sign of the police officers or Wright. Talon sat with Iolani on the veranda, looking out into the shadows. Lorcan and Towman lay on their stomachs facing the screen door, heads between their paws, ears pricked. The stridulation of insects filled the air. Not a breath of wind moved. Above, brilliant stars pierced the black velvet sky. "Do you think they found something?" Iolani asked. "Is that what's taking them so long?" It was impossible to answer. "I'm sure they'll be back soon." Talon was growing concerned. Night had fallen, and the forest wasn't easy to navigate even in broad daylight. As she decided to come right, Iolani leapt to her feet. "What's that?" Something was moving among the trees. Talon also stood up. The dogs padded to the door and pressed their noses against the netting. Rustles sounded from the vegetation. The glow from the veranda light revealed agitated leaves and fronds. A deeper noise started up, a bass-level rumble. Lorcan and Towman were growling, and the fur on their backs bristled. Iolani faced Talon. "Should I let the dogs out?" A figure stepped into the clearing, quickly followed by others. It was hard to make them out in the darkness, but there was something weird about their heads. Their eyes were impossibly large, and they glinted in the light from the veranda. Iolani gripped Talon's arm, her fingers digging in painfully. She reached for the veranda door. Her dogs whined and shuffled, anxious to be set free. Talon pressed a hand against the door. Don't. Wright had appeared. She would have recognized him anywhere. It's okay, she told Iolani. It's the police. They're wearing night vision goggles. Oh. Iolani's small remark held a world of sadness and disappointment. From the stooped, tired gait of the searchers, it was clear Cocoa had not been found, or at least not alive. Talon stepped out while Iolani held her dog's collars. As she walked down the steps to meet Wright, he took off his goggles and shook his head sadly. No sign of her. While the police bedded down in their tents and Iolani's muted sobs came from her bedroom, Talon climbed onto the sofa bed in the living room and lay down in Wright's arms, also missing people she loved dearly. Chapter 6. Talon decided to join the new search the next day, and Iolani wanted to come too. Perhaps reacting to the desperation in her eyes, Moen agreed. After a quick breakfast, she locked Lorcan and Tauman in the veranda, and the party set out. The dogs gave short, yelping barks as the group moved away. Will they be okay? Talon asked her friend. They'll be fine. They're just worried about me. They sense something's wrong, and they must miss Cocoa too. I offered to bring them with us, but Moen said it's better they stay here. He's probably right. I don't want them to eat something they shouldn't again. The plan was to extend the search farther afield than yesterday's effort. Everyone was carrying plenty of water as well as food. It was not anticipated anyone would be returning until nightfall. Moen had outlined the target areas, segments of terrain not checked yet. It was less likely that Cocoa was on the populated lower slopes, where cries for help could be heard and injured hikers seen more easily, but the chief included them too, wanting to cover all the bases. The section allotted to Talon and Iolani was way above the small mountain home, rising right to the peak. 2 police officers accompanied them, while Wright was with the other team. As the person most familiar with the territory, the officers suggested that Iolani took the lead. She and Talon walked ahead of the men, following a trail that began behind the house. It was steep, and Talon was soon puffing. "Did Moen say anything useful last night?" she asked between gasps. The chief had pulled Iolani aside for a private conversation after his return. "Only that he's leaning toward Cocoa's disappearance being simple misadventure, not linked to the monkey's head. He saw the other strange items yesterday, and I showed him the pics we'd taken, but he said it's probably kids messing around. The same with the head. But there aren't any kids around here. And anyway, a child could never have hammered that skull into your door. And what about the body of the monkey? Is he seriously suggesting a kid could have killed it? I heard those things can be vicious." "They can. I certainly wouldn't want to mess with one. He said a jaguar killed it, that someone must have found the head and thought it would be hilarious to play a practical joke. He thinks Cocoa's disappearance is just coincidental." Talon wasn't convinced. On the other hand, the local chief of police probably had a better handle on the situation than she did. "What do you think? Could a jaguar have killed the monkey?" "It's possible. There are jaguars around here, though they're very timid and keep out of sight. I didn't take a close look at the body, so it's hard for me to say. But if that is what happened, the jaguar should have eaten it, not left it lying around in the forest. I hate to mention it, but you and Wright might have disturbed it mid-meal." "Shit, I didn't even think of that." Talon took a look over her shoulder. The 2 police officers were chatting quietly in their own language a little way below them. Thick vegetation crowded in from every side, and the jungle canopy spread out down the slope.
Iolani's house was already obscured, and also, naturally, was the other search team. For reassurance, she touched the tracker Chief Mohan had given everyone. She had fastened hers to her shirt. It really wouldn't take much to become lost in this wild place. "Don't worry," said Iolani. "A jaguar would never approach a group of people." "You don't think—" "Cocoa wasn't attacked by a jaguar. I walked these trails for years while I was doing my research, sometimes without dogs. I only caught glimpses of jaguars a handful of times. We're not one of their prey species." "Any tips on what to look for? Do you remember what Cocoa was wearing when she left?" As Iolani described the clothing, Talon scanned the undergrowth. It looked impenetrable, just meters away. Cocoa could not be far from a trail, unless she had fallen down a slope, in which case she would be extremely difficult to find. Iolani began calling her name. Talon did too, and so did the officers. They were all bent nearly double to scale the incline, grabbing at the greenery for balance and traction. After half an hour, Iolani called a halt. It was almost impossible to climb and shout. Everyone needed to catch their breath. Talon rested a hand on a low-slung branch, drenched in sweat, her chest heaving. Iolani said, "Just about 100 meters till we reach the new search area. It's cooler up there." One of the officers lifted a finger to his ear and bent his head as he listened to a comm. The atmosphere seemed to change. Talon tensed. Iolani looked at her fearfully, but the officer only nodded in response to an unheard comment. "Has something happened?" asked Iolani. "No news." They continued their ascent. The atmosphere began to cool, as Iolani had predicted. By the time they reached the allotted search zone, they had to stop again. The day promised to be long and grueling. Talon hoped with all her heart it was successful. At least with Cocoa there was a chance of finding her. Talon's own loved ones were beyond reach. She sank down onto her backside, heedless of the dampness of the ground penetrating her pants, sucking in lungfuls of humid air. Iolani sat beside her. The police officers moved to their rear. In her tired state, it took Talon a moment to register the incongruity of their behavior. There was no reason for them to. Iolani shrieked. One of the men had grabbed her. At the same time, hands fastened around Talon's arms, jerking them behind her back. Her instincts kicked in. Without thinking, she jabbed her elbow backward, hard. A grunt burst out as it met flesh, and the grip on her arms loosened. She broke free and swung around, her fist following, and punched the man in the jaw. Meanwhile, in her peripheral vision, she could see Iolani being overpowered. She was on her side, her wrists being tied as she struggled and fought. Talon's assailant was on his back, reaching for his gun. She stooped to grab it first, but the momentary distraction of Iolani's plight had been her undoing. The police officer jerked the gun up and aimed at her. She froze. He didn't speak, only held her gaze, while his companion completed Iolani's capture. The man gestured with his gun. "Turn around." "What's going on? Who are you?" Were they even the police? He repeated his command. Iolani's captor hauled her to her feet. If it hadn't been for the danger to her friend, Talon might have risked taking on the officer. But it would be impossible to free herself and Iolani. She faced about and allowed her wrists to be tied. The officer removed her earcom. A heavy hand descended on her shoulder, forcing her forward. "Where are you taking us?" When no one replied, she said, "Do you have any idea what's happening?" A metal object poked in her back, the muzzle of a gun. "No talking." The officers pushed them higher up a trail until they reached an offshoot. It was as barely noticeable as the one where she and Wright had found the dead monkey.
Thick, wide leaves and looping vines impeded her progress as she stumbled along. What had to be going through Iolani's mind? Was this what had happened to Cocoa? Where was Wright? Had he been hurt? They went deeper into the forest. The ground sloped downward. They seemed to be returning to the area they'd left behind, but by a different route. Then a thicker, more trodden path appeared. "That way," the officer commanded, jabbing her with his gun. She ducked under overhanging foliage and stepped into a clearing, abruptly drawing to a halt and sucking in a deep breath. There was Wright on his knees, a bag over his head. And there was Cocoa. She was hooded too. Her clothing was dirty and torn, and a deep cut ran down from her shoulder, as if she had been dragged over something sharp. Where had she been since yesterday morning? And there was Chief Moen, except he wasn't in his uniform. A blood-red robe fell from his neck to his feet, and a hat of the same colour sat on his head, spreading wide from the circle that encased his skull. Moen signalled, and Talon and Iolani were shoved downward to a kneeling position. The chief of police, if that was who he really was, nodded his satisfaction. 4 little birds trapped in a cage. It took a while to get you, but the bonus birds were worth the wait. Bring them to the centre." Talon and Iolani had to get to their feet and join Wright and Cocoa. Moen instructed his men to remove the hoods, and Talon could make eye contact with Wright at last. He winked, as if trying to reassure her that everything would be okay, but she couldn't see a way out of whatever Moen had in store. It was 4 armed aggressors against 4 unarmed, restrained captives, 2 of whom were not trained to fight or even brawny. Moen stepped closer. "Lieutenant Colonel Wright and Talon Ellis. What a piece of luck you happened to arrive at the right moment. Oh yes, Ellis, I know who you are and how important you think you are. Don't think I didn't notice you pouting when I praised your husband." He chuckled. "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Am I right, TJ?" Wright growled. "What the fuck do you think you're doing? Are you insane?" Talon was at a loss. What could Moen's motivation be? He had to be crazy, but he'd persuaded at least 3 other people to join him. How? Why? "Let the others go," said Iolani. "You've clearly got a beef with me, but there's no need to drag innocent people into it. Let Cocoa, Wright and Talon leave, and I'll do whatever you want." "No way," Talon protested. "And not until I've made these bastards pay." "That makes 2 of us," said Wright. Moen smiled. "So, Ms. Hale, we have another person full of her own importance. Please don't flatter yourself. Wright and Ellis are more valuable to me than you. They were just far less reachable, living as they do in civilized lands. Did, I should say. Kidnapping is so much easier here." While he talked, his goons spread themselves out in a rough triangle. There was something different about them, a change in their expressions she couldn't quite put her finger on. Was it fear or adoration they showed when they looked toward Moen? Their expressions reminded her of... "Let's get down to it," Moen said. "You know where our beloved leader is and how to get her back. Tell me and you can live. When she has returned, I will release you. Refuse and you die, one by one, while your companions watch." "Your beloved leader?" Iolani echoed. "You have no friends here," Moen went on. "No one knows you're missing, and no one will be looking for you. I can hold you as long as I like, as long as it takes. And if you don't give up your secrets, I'm no worse off than when I started. So, what's it to be? Where is she? What's happened to her? Why didn't she return?" "Who?" Iolani demanded. "Who the hell are you?" "The Dweer,"
Talon said. "He means Dwyer all." "Holy shit," said Kekoa. "Not that bitch. She's—" "Shh," Talon hissed. If Moan understood Or would never return to Earth, that she was unable to, he might kill them all on the spot. What did he have to lose? In this wild place, who would ever find out?
"Of course I mean our beloved Dwyer,"
Moan snapped.
"What have you done with her? She must have returned with you on the Defiant. She would never desert her people. The Britannic Alliance is obviously lying and has her imprisoned somewhere. Perhaps she's been executed. If she has, you'll soon be following her."
"She wasn't executed," Talon replied. "She's still alive." Her mind raced. What could she tell this maniac to appease him while they figured out a way to escape?
"Very much alive,"
Wright said.
"along with her son."
Moan nodded.
"I knew it. I knew I would feel it in my bones if she was dead."
"All that junk on the trees," Iolani said. "The bits of dead animals and the insects. That was you all along?"
"Ha! I don't make the offerings. Those are the sacrifices of lesser people. It's my duty to keep the faith alive, and I've done my duty, like my father did before me. I've kept our beliefs strong all these years, and now it's time for my reward, for my triumph. I will return the Dwyer to her faithful followers. More are already on their way here, when you tell me where she is."
"Release us and I'll tell you," said Talon. "Not before. If we tell you now, there's nothing to stop you from killing us anyway."
"Maybe you'll just have to trust me,"
Moan replied, hooding his eyes. "If we're dead, you'll never find your Dwyer," Talon insisted. "You'll never get another chance to capture someone from the Defiant. You'll never get Or back. And what will you do then? Just how furious will she be, how disappointed in you, if she discovers you had your chance and fluffed it?" Doubt momentarily clouded Moan's features, but then manic savagery returned.
"If I release you, you will never tell me, when you've worked so hard to prevent her fulfilling her destiny. I will make you reveal her location, one by one."
His gaze travelled to each captive.
"I will test you. I have many ways, and finally one of you will prefer death and an end to the pain, or an end to the suffering of someone you love. And then I will know the truth."
He approached Wright and jabbed a finger at him. Turning to one of the police officers, he said,
"Start with this."
Wright pistoned to his feet, thrusting the top of his skull into Moan's jaw. The man's head snapped back, and he staggered before collapsing. Talon ran at another of the officers, driving her knee into his solar plexus. When he was down, she booted his temple so hard the judder ran up her leg. He was out cold. Meanwhile, Wright had gone for another of the officers. The men wrestled on the ground, Wright holding down the arm that held the gun with the weight of his body. The third officer, a woman, aimed her weapon uncertainly at Talon, fear in her eyes. Talon stalked toward her, brow lowered. "You wouldn't dare!" Chief Moan groaned. He was beginning to come around. The female officer's gaze flicked to him and then back to Talon, the resolve on her face strengthening. Talon ran at her. The flash of a pulse round lit up the scene like lightning. Agony exploded. The grassy ground rushed up to Talon's face, and suddenly she was down. All she could feel was pain. It occupied her world, shutting out all sound, all vision. Distantly, she heard herself screaming. Chapter 7. She was alive. By some miracle, she was alive. The pain had barely abated, but her brain, as if finally understanding there was nothing she could do about it, was allowing information in from her surroundings. She was on her back, a circle of blue sky framed by tree canopy above her.
Voices encroached, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. With a monumental effort, she turned her head to the side. Moen was back on his feet, though he still looked groggy. Blood dribbled from his mouth, his hat had fallen off, and his ridiculous robe was askew. The officer she had knocked out sprawled on the ground, motionless. Perhaps she had killed him. The two others flanked Moen, staring down at... Shit! Wright had not got away. The man he'd been fighting must have overpowered him. Maybe he'd been distracted by her getting shot. He lay between Iolani and Cocoa, his wrists and ankles fastened to stakes.
"We won't be seeing a repeat of that incident," Moen was saying, "because I will start with you, Lieutenant Colonel. You will be the first to suffer, and the experience will put you out of action. Will you reveal the Dweir's location? This is your final chance."
Wright cursed bitterly, and his gaze shifted to Talon, deep grief etching his features. Then they made eye contact. Shock and joy broke out over his face. He shifted. New energy seemed to flood him. He looked up at Moen and the officers, apparently reassessing the situation. But what could he do? His hands and feet were tied. Iolani and Cocoa didn't know how to help him, and she was useless, utterly incapacitated.
"I'm disappointed," Moen said, "but not too much. Your blood and agony will invigorate the Horned One before you finally give in. No matter how long it takes, in the end the result will be the same. Our Dweir will return to us, and the old ways will begin again."
He took a step back. The officers dragged Cocoa and Iolani to the edge of the clearing, leaving Wright by himself in the center. Then they returned. The man took out a knife. Talon's heart froze. Wright looked at her again. She knew his meaning.
"Look away. Don't watch."
But her attention was fixed by horror. She couldn't close her eyes. The man slit Wright's shirt from his pants to the collar, and the woman pulled it over his shoulders, exposing his chest. Talon whimpered. Moen swiveled, his eyes blazing.
"Ellis is still alive? Even better. The Horned One will have 2 blood sacrifices today."
I'll... She couldn't get the words out. The tiniest movement sent shards of pain lancing through her. But a worse agony was what was about to happen to the man she loved, the man whose unending kindness, generosity of spirit, and loyalty had kept him by her side, flawed as she was. It didn't matter if Moen killed her. How could she go on without Wright? She couldn't bear to see him hurt. A growl of frustration, impotence, and despair rose up from her stomach. Moen chuckled. He nodded at the male officer.
"Begin."
The man crouched and angled the knife downward, pushing the tip into the soft spot at the base of Wright's neck. He drew it slowly along his chest, slitting the skin. Wright's muscles bunched and his jaw tightened, but he didn't make a sound. Iolani and Cocoa softly gasped. One of them, Talon could not see who, began to weep. Still, Talon could not look away. The scene was surreal, unbelievable, impossible. How could she have thought her life no longer held any happiness when there was a rustle of vegetation, the drum of fast padding, and a black blur flashed into the clearing? The creature leapt for the male officer. The attack was almost silent as the man fell to the ground. He didn't even manage to scream before his throat was ripped out. A brief gurgle emanated as blood flooded from the wound in gushes. For a second, Talon thought a black jaguar had entered the clearing and launched into a predatory frenzy. Would it kill them all? But it was not a jaguar. Lorcan and Tauman had escaped the veranda. As the first dog to appear turned from the dying man, the second arrived and instantly went for Moen, who was a statue of terror watching his officer die. In a flurry of snarls and snaps, Moen also fell. The dog loomed over him. Futilely, his hands waved and legs kicked as the animal busied itself around his head and throat. Meanwhile, the first dog focused on the only crusader who remained standing. It lifted its lips to reveal sharp, bloody teeth, a deep growl vibrating the air. The woman's gun rose, shaking violently as the whites of her eyes shone out in the shadows. Her other hand rose as if trying to steady her aim. The dog leapt. Talon had not been able to close the distance between her and her assailant before being shot, but the animal had no such problem. Lorcan and Tauman's attack was over in less than a minute. Moen and the 2 police officers were dead. The third had stayed unconscious throughout the ordeal. Wright was silent, his cut chest quickly rising and falling. Cocoa gaped, her face pale. The dogs trotted to Iolani, tails wagging and ears pricked, their muzzles drenched in blood. They nudged her happily and then sat down, anticipating pats. "Good boys," she murmured. "Good boys." Chapter 8. Iolani had used her heli to fly Talon to the nearest hospital. No doctors or nurses asked any questions about who she was or how she'd sustained her wound. It was the way things worked here. The medical professionals told her she should not have survived. A few millimeters deeper penetration of the round would have injured her heart sufficiently to stop it beating. And that would have been that. Certainly, Wright had been correct to conclude she had died. He'd seen enough soldiers killed by pulse fire in his time. His wound was superficial and quickly healed by the application of a gel. Within hours, his body responded and sealed up the cut without even leaving a scar. Her recovery and recuperation would take longer, but the prognosis was she would suffer no lasting physical effects. The same could not be said for her psychological state. Not by her, anyway. She would never forget the time she had come within a whisker of seeing the man she loved tortured to death. Cocoa had also recovered from her ordeal. She had been hurt by her cultist kidnappers, and the night she'd spent gagged and bound in the jungle had taken its toll, but she emerged unscarred. Lorcan and Tauman had required treatment too, for the damage they'd done to their paws and mouths as they broke through the veranda netting. No dogs ever received more loving attention to their injuries. Iolani wasn't sure what exactly had alerted them, but she guessed they must have heard her or Talon's screams. On the day before Talon was due to be discharged, Iolani and Cocoa came to see her. Wright had stepped out to stretch his legs. He'd barely left her side all the while she'd been in hospital. "Are you going straight back to the BI?" Cocoa asked. "I think so. I mean, Suriname's nice, but the Crusader cult hangover is putting you off." "Something like that." They chuckled, but then Iolani grew serious. "Talon, I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize." She had been waiting for this. "Don't take responsibility for those maniacs' actions. None of what happened is your or Cocoa's fault. I would hate it if I left here knowing you blamed yourself. So please, don't." Iolani sighed. "All right." "What about you?" Talon asked. "Are you going to leave the mountain now?" "We thought about it." She shared a look with Cocoa. "And we're still thinking about it. We haven't been back to the house yet. We've been staying in a hotel with the dogs while the police complete their investigation." "The police? How can you trust them?" "They've admitted the corruption in their ranks and invited the global nation's security division to oversee an internal inquiry. But there's no saying whether Crusaders exist outside the force. Do you remember Moen telling us more of them were on their way?" "I do." Iolani looked down and shrugged. "Like I said, we have some thinking to do."
Would the world ever be rid of the influence of the Earth Awareness Crusade? Talon doubted it. Despite all the improvements that had taken place while she'd been on the Defiant, one thing hadn't changed: human nature and its habit of developing weird beliefs. If it wasn't Crusaders, some other strange cult was bound to pop up. "I know what you should do," Talon announced. Iolani looked up. "Come and stay with me and Wright in West BI. We have plenty of room now Kayla's gone for the autumn term. You can get away from all this heat and humidity and decide what you want to do, depending on what the police discover." "That sounds like a great idea," said Cocoa. "But what about Lorcan and Talman?" asked Iolani. In truth, Talon had some reservations about the dogs now she'd seen them in action, though she would be eternally grateful to them. "They can come too." Iolani grinned. "Then it's a deal." Cocoa chuckled. "I think Lorcan Talman finally redeemed himself for kidnapping you. In spirit at least." Wright returned, bearing a coffee in each hand. "Oops, I didn't know you had visitors. I can go and get some more." "Never mind that," said Talon. "I have some news. Iolani and Cocoa are coming home with us."
"Really? Fantastic. We can show them around."
"I would love it," said Cocoa. "I've never been to the BI." Now that the next few months of her life were decided, sudden tiredness hit Talon, and she yawned. "We should let you rest," said Iolani. "You're still recovering." "No, it's okay." But her friends were already standing up. Cocoa said, "I'll comm you, TJ, about flight tickets, etc."
"Sure, we'll be travelling home the fast way this time."
They said their goodbyes, and Talon and Wright were alone again. She took his hand. "Though we've had a bloody awful time, one good thing has come of it, for me at least."
"What's that?"
"When we were in the jungle, and I really thought we'd had it, when I thought I was going to lose you, and in the most horrible way." She swallowed the lump that had formed in her throat.
"Let's not talk about it."
"I want to. I just wanted to say, I learned to appreciate what I have. That's what I'm going to focus on from now on, appreciating what I have."
"I see."
He put a finger to his lip.
"Does that mean I can expect to be waited on, hand and foot? Bacon and eggs for breakfast every morning? Back massages every night?"
"Now wait a minute. Don't get ideas above your station, Major Wright." He kissed her. Part 2, Found. Chapter 1. He hadn't been given time to say goodbye, to his great regret. Patrin would never forget the look on Mam's face when he'd announced his decision to remain with the aliens on their planet. It had seemed an obvious choice. What was a few months or even years of his life in exchange for the lives of everyone aboard the Defiant, including the people who had died? And the aliens promised to stop interfering in human affairs. Who in their right mind would refuse? Yet when he remembered Mam's reaction, he couldn't help thinking he'd made a huge mistake. At least Arthur was here too. That was something. They'd moved to this room in an army barracks as if by magic. He guessed everything the aliens did would seem like magic, though only because they were so much more advanced than humans. Merlin had said he could appear on Earth in an instant, without the use of a starship. Would that be how he would send him back, just like that? He hoped it wouldn't take too long. Mam had said something about time passing differently here. Arthur turned from the window of their little room.
"Soldiers are practicing in the yard. They look real, but they must be phantasms, like the knights we fought in the battle."
Must be. Patrin, sitting on one of the two bunks, looked up at the older man.
"How long do you think Merlin and Morgan will keep us?"
He missed Mam and Kayla already, but he was reluctant to admit it. He didn't want to look weak in front of this famous warrior.
"There is no telling. Both are whimsical and fickle. Morgan especially so."
Even when Merlin was my friend, I couldn't entirely trust him to follow through with his promises. We cannot rely upon any reassurance they give. We are entirely under their power. Perhaps we can only hope they grow bored of us soon and send us home.
Patrin swallowed. Did I do the right thing, sir? I mean, agreeing to stay. Arthur smiled warmly and joined him on the bunk.
Patrin, you must call me Arthur. I have never enjoyed the airs and graces accompanying my kingship. It would please me greatly if we could be more like friendly companions than a king and his squire.
Patrin nodded, though he couldn't imagine ever feeling like an equal with this great man.
As to whether you made the right decision,
Arthur continued,
there was no decision to be made. Had you refused, you would have died, and so would have all our company. Merlin and Morgan knew this full well. Their proposal had only one possible answer, and you gave it, as would any rational person. Don't concern yourself with doubts. Our predicament is very simple. We must face whatever lies in store for us with brave hearts. That is all.
Placing a hand on Patrin's shoulder, he added,
I have only one caveat, my friend, and it is one that you ignored despite my earlier request.
Huh? What's that?
When we first arrived on this new world, and we were waiting for Merlin or Morgan to meet us, I had a great foreboding, and I mentioned it to you. Do you remember?
Yes. A heavy feeling settled in Patrin's stomach.
I'm sorry. I am glad you have not forgotten. I asked you not to put your life in danger out of loyalty to me, but you did so anyway.
I know I went back on my promise, but I was so angry about what Merlin had done to you. Recalling the joust, Patrin gained courage.
And if I hadn't forced him to fight again, we would all have been killed. I am aware of the paradox. I forgive you. I understand why you behaved as you did, but my request stands. I do not know what the future holds or what the beings of this world plan to do to us, but I don't want you to repeat your earlier mistake. I want you to swear to me on the lives of your mother and sister that you will not do such a thing again. You must not risk your life to save mine. Though we may be friends, I am still your king, and I ask you to make this oath to me as your royal sovereign.
Arthur's features transformed from those of an affable older man to a solemn, dignified elder. His blue eyes held Patrin's gaze sternly. I swear, sire, on the lives of my mother and sister. Arthur's face relaxed.
I am satisfied.
He rose to his feet and stretched his arms wide.
Merlin has not reinvigorated me, more's the pity. I would not have objected to that particular charm. My age creeps up on me apace, faster than it would naturally. I fear he will not be affording me any protection in the trials to come.
But I thought they just wanted to study us. Patrin's vague idea had been that the aliens might examine them or ask them questions. They said they wanted to understand humans better. Returning to the window and resting his elbows on the sill, Arthur replied,
I knew Merlin all my life, and Morgan for most of it. Even so, I doubt I know them well. But if my past experiences of them are anything to go by, their study will not be the serious examination you expect. They are playful creatures, delighting in intrigue, rivalry, and strife. And, as your mother divined, their greatest delight is to see humans desperately cling to life. It is that aspect of us that most interests them, which does not bode well for us, unfortunately. That is the reason I made you swear your oath. I know you are not an oath-breaker.
The door opened, and in walked Merlin. No trace remained of the wound Patrin had inflicted when he pierced the alien's throat with his lance. What was the creature made from? Not flesh and blood. He could melt his body into a pool of liquid and make it solid again. He wore a black robe and a close-fitting cap that covered most of his head and short silver hair. He knitted his fingers, his gaze drifting from Arthur to Patrin as he seemed to consider his words. I must confess, I had relished the prospect of punishing the rude visitors who had turned up at our door uninvited, but now I'm of a different mind. Morgan's idea was inspired. This new game promises to be even more engaging than the last. Patrin stood up. You said you wanted to get to know us better, not to continue playing with us. Merlin cocked an eyebrow at Arthur. Your young friend is rather outspoken, is he not? You should rein him in before he gets himself into trouble. Patrin is his own man, Arthur replied. He is not under my command, and I endorse his sentiment. If you only plan on continuing your old habit of toying with human emotions, then you are keeping us here under false pretenses. You know better than to hold me to my word, Merlin said darkly. Indeed I do, you old fox. If it's to be more of the same, send the boy home. You don't need him. Ah, if only I could. Morgan would object, unfortunately. Arthur snorted in disgust and returned his attention to the view outside the window. Patrin said, Maybe there are things you can learn from us, if you're willing. Merlin's lips creased into a thin smile. Go on, I'm fascinated. Counting the words on his fingers, Patrin said, Honesty, trustworthiness, integrity. A peal of laughter from the alien interrupted his recitation. I lived among humans for hundreds of Earth years, far longer than Arthur's lifetime. The characteristics you mention are not as common as you might think. They are certainly not representative of humanity. It's true that not everyone has them, but a lot more than your kind do, that's for sure. My kind? Who are my kind? What are they? Do you think you know? When Patrin didn't answer, Merlin yawned, lifting the back of his hand to his mouth. I am here to tell you what you can expect. It will make things more interesting if you are prepared. Morgan and I have devised some tasks for you to complete. If you perform them to our satisfaction, you may return to Earth. That isn't what we agreed, Patrin protested. Merlin smirked. Then file a complaint with the relevant authority. Oops, I was forgetting. There isn't one. He gave a small cough. Seriously, the outcome of our scheme will not be significantly different from the agreed purpose of your stay. By observing what you do, we may learn nuances of human psychology we previously overlooked. You see, Carla Orr and her son will be with you. Dissimilarities between your actions and those of the half-breeds may shed light on traits which are uniquely human. Tasks? Asked Arthur. Are they dangerous? You know how fragile our bodies are compared to yours. If something were to happen to Patrin, you would do what? Regardless, Patrin is Morgan's responsibility. She was the one who wanted two of you, and the one spouting all that motherhood nonsense. Patrin sank onto the bunk. Merlin, said Arthur, I ask you once more, I beg you, return the boy to Earth. I am fully human. I repeat, you have no need to involve another of us in your game. Need was never my motivation. Merlin left. Thanks for trying to help, Patrin said, but I would feel bad if you were here by yourself. And now we know we have to associate with Carla Orr and Perrin. He grimaced. It would be extra unfair. No one should have to deal with that pair alone. I am quite used to the likes of Carla Orr. Do not fear for me in that regard. I am more concerned that you may not survive this unscathed. Your mother went to great lengths to find you and your sister when you were kidnapped by the Crusaders. I must protect you at all costs, but I am not sure exactly how. I will understand more when the tasks are revealed. Chapter 2. Row upon row and column upon column of buildings ran between them and the horizon, rising and falling, following the lie of the land. Patrin was reminded of the town where he had grown up, except there were no gardens or trees or parks, nothing green at all, and the buildings varied greatly in size and shape. Some rose so tall they disappeared into the clouds. Others spread wide and flat like square pancakes. They were all the same colour, a pale blue that matched the patches of sky between the clouds. They had to be constructed from the same material. The uniformity, despite the different sizes and shapes, was somehow unnerving. The metropolis felt unnatural, though Patrin couldn't put his finger on why. Figures moved between the buildings. Were they people? At the distance it was hard to tell. "What do you think of this place?" Merlin asked. They stood on a hill bordering the city. How they'd arrived here Patrin did not know. One moment he'd been talking to Arthur in the barracks room. The next he was on the hill, the wind stirring his hair. "This is where your people live?" Arthur asked. "One place of many. It reminds me of the cities of Earth." Movement in his peripheral vision caught Patrin's attention. Carla Orr and Perrin had appeared on the slope of the neighbouring hill, accompanied by Morgan Le Fay. "How big do you think it is?" asked Merlin. Arthur replied, "I cannot see its end." "Does it seem a friendly place, safe to traverse?" Turning his silver-haired head, Arthur faced the alien. "Is that the first task? Must we cross the city?" "That would be far too simple and easy." Patrin said, "We have to beat Orr and her son, right?" Merlin smirked. "A pleasant notion. It would certainly add tension to the game." Arthur nudged him with his elbow. Patrin silently remonstrated with himself. They were in deep enough shit as it was without giving the aliens more ideas on how to make their lives difficult. "I will consider it for later exercises," Merlin went on. "Today you must only cross the city, as Arthur guessed, but you must do it before sunset." Patrin's gaze swung to a bright patch of cloud hiding the sun. The star hung halfway between the horizon and its zenith. He didn't know which direction was north. "Is it morning or afternoon?" Merlin's smirk widened. "How long has it been since the Defiant departed?" Arthur asked. "It seems many hours, but I am not hungry or thirsty." "Your primitive needs are irrelevant here. The atmosphere nourishes you," Merlin added sarcastically. "You will not need to stop for lunch along the way." "So it's morning," said Patrin. "How long is a day on this planet?" "What an inquisitive young human." On the farther hill, Morgan was speaking with Orr and Perrin, no doubt also outlining the rules of the task. Would she give them additional information? It seemed impossible that the two aliens wouldn't set up some sort of competition between the humans and half-humans. It was exactly the kind of thing they seemed to love. "Is what you're asking us to do achievable?" asked Arthur, his brows lowered. "Why would I set you a task you cannot possibly complete?" "To tickle your fancy, of course. If you really want to discover what it means to be human, you need only observe us, not play these games. But in honesty, I believe you have no interest in observing humanity. You only want to prolong the game you began when you came to our planet millennia ago. You want—" This time it was Patrin who nudged Arthur. He had a feeling that revealing what they thought about the aliens was unwise. Also, time was getting on. If something important hinged on their success, they should get moving. "So we only have to cross the city before sunset? There are no other conditions?" "That is all. And if we fail, then we shall see what we shall see. Come on, Arthur, let's go." It wasn't only a sense of wariness that compelled him to begin immediately. He was also genuinely curious to enter the city. He was one of the first human beings to set foot on an exoplanet. and not any old exoplanet, but one inhabited by an intelligent extraterrestrial species. The prospect of seeing them up close intrigued him. Arthur appeared troubled, though he followed as Patrin descended the slope.
It might have been wiser to talk with Merlin longer. He could have revealed helpful information. He might have fed us lies, too, to trip us up, just for fun. That is true.
Patrin looked over his shoulder. Merlin was gone. Morgan Le Fay had disappeared as well, and Carla Orr and Perrin were walking down their hill. They stepped into the shadow of a building, a skyscraper so tall its upper floors were invisible, lost in the misty vapour that overhung the place. Square blank windows rose up the facade until they disappeared out of sight.
No glass,
Patrin murmured. The rectangular shapes weren't reflective. They were dark and opaque, and they were flush with the outer surface, almost as if they'd been painted on.
Let us hurry, said Arthur. There will be nothing of interest to see in this place, and we must reach the other side as quickly as we can. Who knows what punishment Merlin may have in store?
He was already striding down the street. Patrin hurried after him. He was also unsure what Merlin might do if they failed. The alien seemed to value the presence of humans on his planet, reversing his earlier reaction when he'd almost killed them. But there was one thing Patrin did not want to lose, and that was the agreement to return him to Earth. Mam had been through enough in her time. He didn't want her heart to break from losing him forever. The thoroughfare was empty. He wasn't sure where Carla Orr and her son had entered the city, but it was somewhere else. Figures were crossing the road at the junction, however. His footsteps slowed as they neared them. There was something odd about the people. He didn't know what he'd been expecting, possibly creatures who looked similar to Merlin and Morgan, but it wasn't this. They weren't wearing clothes or shoes, and they were grey. Arthur strode ahead, his long legs eating the distance, silver mane flowing in the breeze. Patrin broke from his bemusement and sped up his pace. As he reached Arthur, the old king began to transform. His burly body slimmed down and shrank.
Arthur? What, Patrin? We must make haste.
He didn't slow down. Arthur's clothes disappeared, and in their place grey skin grew, the same as the figures in the distance. Patrin couldn't go on. He halted, his mouth agape.
Arthur, stop! You're...
Arthur must have registered the note of panic in his voice, for this time he halted and turned. But the man who faced Patrin was not his beloved liege. It was a weird creature, naked and hairless. Wide black eyes with no white and no lids slowly blinked. A lipless mouth opened into an O.
Patrin, what has become of you?
What's become of me? What about... Fear drying up his words, he looked down. 2 long grey featureless limbs had replaced his legs. He lifted trembling hands. 5 fingers had transformed to 4, and the digits were the same colour as the rest of his new body.
You're the same,
he blurted.
What's happened to us?
Perhaps it was another of Merlin's jokes. Perhaps the shock was intended to slow them down. Whatever the reason for their metamorphosis, there was nothing they could do except accept it and continue on.
We won't stand out among the citizens of this place now,
Arthur said.
I expect Merlin will return us to our former state later. Let us move on.
How many minutes had already passed since they'd entered the city? They ran to the end of the street. A wide avenue traversed it, thronged with grey folk. They varied in height and weight like humans. Some appeared to be children, holding their parents' hands as they walked. The figures spoke to each other, but Patrin didn't know their language. Vehicles also moved along the avenue, 2-wheeled and 4-wheeled. They even had autobuses. Arthur darted across the roadway during a break in the traffic. Patrin followed, but not quite quickly enough, causing a vehicle to brake. The person sitting in it shouted and shook a four-fingered fist. As they jogged down the next street, Patrin squinted at the sky. The sun wasn't visible above the buildings yet. They passed a window at street level, and he was surprised to see this one was made of glass. Creatures sitting at tables could be seen inside, chatting and eating. Eating! Merlin had said the air contained nutrients, eliminating the need to eat. Arthur! He wanted to show the king the strange phenomenon. What did it mean? But his newly transformed companion ignored him. Patrin feared he might lose him in the crowd if he didn't keep up. There was little difference between Arthur and the other pedestrians, except for the fact that he was clearly in a hurry. Patrin pushed past a group of the aliens. Was their hairless, bulbous-headed, black-eyed form what Merlin and Morgan really looked like? He ached to stop and try to communicate with one of them. The reason he'd agreed to stay behind was to find out more about this place, but Merlin had deprived him of the opportunity. Arthur! They'd reached the end of the block. It was not a crossroads. The opposite side of the street held no exit. Which way? Asked Arthur. Left or right? Right? I don't think it matters. They jogged down the street, waiting for a lull in the traffic, and then crossed it. Soon an alley opened up. As they ran down it, Patrin spotted another glass window. He couldn't resist the urge to look inside. Grey creatures sat at desks, working on interfaces. Surprise made him stop and stare. First a cafe or restaurant, now an office. What was going on? Was life on this planet so remarkably similar to the way humans behaved on Earth? He wanted to discuss what he was seeing with Arthur, but the alleyway was empty. Arthur! Patrin flew to the end and peered out. The creatures walked and drove the streets the same as before. The effect was unsettling. Put clothes and hair on the aliens, and they could almost be people. Where had his friend gone? One of the pedestrians was taller and walking faster than the others. Dodging the creatures in his way, Patrin ran to the potential Arthur and grabbed its shoulder. It spun around, and for a fraction of a second, Patrin thought he'd made a mistake. Could this no-nose being really be a king? Patrin, is that you? Thank the stars, I nearly lost you. You must keep up. Don't make me remind you again. The end of a broad street faced them. I think this may lead us a long way into this horrible place, Arthur said. They ran along the edge of the pavement, avoiding the vehicles and the pedestrians. Arthur had made Patrin go in front, to keep an eye on him presumably. The king had a remarkable ability to focus on a task, regardless of what was going on in his surroundings. Patrin tried to emulate him, but again and again his gaze was drawn to scenes playing out around them. A small version of one of the creatures fell over, and its larger parent picked it up and patted it soothingly. A couple of aliens walking arm in arm suddenly faced each other and pressed their mouths together. Kissing? A grey being halted at the edge of a road and waved at the traffic. One of the vehicles peeled out of the flow and parked, collecting a passenger before moving on. This way! Arthur shouted. A diagonal thoroughfare led off to the left. Arthur probably thought it would get them across the city faster. Patrin had long since lost all sense of direction. He looked up. The sun peeked over the roof of a tall building. Nearly midday already? He could have sworn less than an hour had passed. But this planet might have a faster rotation than Earth. Merlin had been careful to avoid telling them anything about it. After taking the new direction, they were in shadow, tall constructions looming on each side. For the first time, grey creatures who were running appeared, and they were running directly toward them. The creatures stared as they ran, making eye contact. Another first. Up until now they'd been mostly ignored. Do not speak to them, Arthur warned.
"I fear they mean to delay us."
Like the rest of the aliens, there was little to tell between them except for their body size. One was nearly as tall as Arthur, the other was shorter and slimmer. The latter's smaller stature made what it did next extra surprising. As it neared Arthur, it diverted its path to come closer to the king. Arthur tried to run around it, but the alien drew back a fist and punched him in the stomach. Clearly taken entirely by surprise, the king gave out an oof and doubled over. Patrin raced to his aid, but the taller alien had made a beeline for him. He ducked and only narrowly avoided the fist that had swung where his head had been. Why were they being attacked? Were the aliens trying to prevent them from reaching their goal? Patrin punched upward, catching his attacker under his chin. His knuckles sank horribly into soft grey flesh. Did these things even have bones? His opponent stumbled and fell. Meanwhile, Arthur had managed to get his assailant into a headlock. "Leave me alone, you bastard," the thing hissed. It spoke English. But wait, Patrin recognized the voice.
"Carla Orr,"
Arthur growled.
"How like you to try to make us fail at our task, even at the expense of your own failure. Let me go. You started this. I've half a mind to twist your head off. These strange new bodies we have may make it possible."
The creature who had swung at Patrin, Perrin Orr, he presumed, was rising to his feet. Patrin kicked his legs out from under him, causing him to land hard on his butt. Except none of them had butts anymore. He pushed Perrin onto his back and put a foot on his chest to keep him down. "If you wait here any longer," Carla said, "you will fail."
"If I set you free, you will attack us again,"
Perrin gasped.
"We won't, I promise. I tried to persuade Mother against it, but she insisted. She said this is what Morgan really wants, for us to make you lose." "She may be right,"
said Arthur.
"All the more reason for me to put an end to your darling parent."
He grabbed one side of Carla's head with his large paw. His fingers sinking into the grey flesh, he dragged it around. Carla screamed.
"Don't do it,"
yelled Perrin.
"I'll make her leave you alone. You won't see us again, I guarantee it."
"Arthur," said Patrin,
"we should give them a chance. They are half-human after all, and they're trapped here. They will never be allowed to return to Earth."
The king didn't relinquish his hold at first, but seconds later he threw Carla Orr to the ground.
"Hurry, Patrin."
During the short fight, the sun had surmounted the sky. It shone directly down the road, illuminating the grey figures of Carla and Perrin as they left them behind. They reached the corner and the king slowed down. His breath was coming in short puffs. Patrin was feeling the pace too, yet they seemed nowhere near the edge of the city. Buildings surrounded them on all sides.
"Which way?"
asked the king.
"I don't know. Let's try down there."
The new direction seemed as good as any. From Patrin's memory of the view of the city and the position of the sun, they would definitely be heading away from the hills. It also felt better to keep moving than to come to a complete halt and try to assess their surroundings. Everything looked the same anyway, oddly Earth-like. As they jogged along, Arthur said,
"You were right to remind me to show pity and mercy. Sometimes, when faced with evil in the guise of Carla Orr, it's easy to forget. I don't know if we did the right thing. I've a feeling it won't be long before we see them again, despite Perrin's promise." "Maybe so, but that would be their fault, not ours."
After a while, Patrin's lungs began to burn. His leg muscles already ached. They'd been running at a fast pace, and he'd grown unfit during his time on the Defiant. Where was the end to the city? They ran on. As his fatigue increased, Patrin began to imagine he could see Carla Orr and her son again amongst the crowd. Any pair unevenly matched in height could be them. Perhaps he did see them, but no more of the grey creatures approached. In fact, they seemed uninterested in the two runners. When the task was over, would Merlin change them back to their original form? Surely he would not allow them to remain like this forever. Was that the reward for success? To become human once more? Was the punishment for failure to remain as they were? How would he live on Earth looking like this? The sun had disappeared from overhead ages ago, and now the light was dimming. Time was running out. His throat was sore from panting, and his legs on fire. He began to long for a glimpse of the city boundary. What lay at the farther edge? More hills? Arthur had been running slower for a while, and Patrin had eased his pace to match the older man. But suddenly the king drew to a complete stop. His hands on his knees and his odd features strained with effort, he squeezed out a few words.
"Go on without me. I cannot run farther. No way."
Patrin put an arm over Arthur's shoulders, his own chest sucking in huge lungfuls of air.
"You can make it." "I cannot. I am at the end of my strength." "You can walk at least. Let's walk."
Arthur stepped forward slowly.
"There is no point. You must continue alone."
"I won't do it."
"Patrin,"
he wheezed.
"You took an oath, remember?"
"I know, but this isn't a life and death situation. We don't know if I'm giving my life for yours by staying with you." They staggered on. Arthur appeared too exhausted to argue. The streets stretched out, lacking any apparent limit. The sky was darkening.
"You know,"
said Patrin, beginning to catch his breath,
"I don't think there is an end to this city. I think it goes on forever." "You may be right. It would be exactly the kind of joke Merlin would love."
The atmosphere was growing chilly, and a rose tint lit the sky. The endless stream of pedestrians and vehicles was lessening. They turned a corner, one of so many Patrin had lost count. A thoroughfare opened up, similar to all the others. It was as if they were trapped in a gigantic labyrinth with no beginning or end. Then the rose tint above them swiftly faded and was replaced by twilight. They had failed. A figure appeared from nowhere at the end of the street. Clad in his black gown and cap, Merlin smiled superciliously. Arthur and Patrin slowly hobbled up to him. There was no point in trying to avoid their fate, whatever it might be. They were entirely under the creature's control.
"Tut, tut, my boys,"
Merlin chided.
"A good effort, but not good enough. It's time to pay the price."
He lifted a hand dramatically and flicked his fingers upward. Patrin flew into the air. He rose high above the city, through the misty clouds and into the upper atmosphere. He choked in the freezing thin air and flailed about. The icy temperature began to bite. Was this how he would die, asphyxiated and frozen? He began to move sideways. Craning his neck, he saw Arthur following, though the king's head hung down as if he was already unconscious. Dark clouds moved beneath, obscuring the land below. Abruptly, whatever force was keeping him aloft vanished. He plummeted, falling so fast he barely registered his passage through the clouds. A black expanse rushed up at him. He briefly recognized the indistinct forms of waves before he dropped feet first into water and it closed over his head. Somehow the impact didn't kill him. He sank deep. Gradually his momentum slowed and he floated in the depths of the ocean. Up had to be above his head. He kicked, his lungs straining for air. He swam on, but didn't emerge from the water. Everything was forgotten. Arthur, Mam, Kayla and Wright, Earth, Merlin, Morgan, Carla and Perrin all slipped from his mind except for the single focus of being able to breathe. Yet no matter how hard he kicked or how high his arms reached, he couldn't get to the surface. His body rebelled against his control, yearning for sweet oxygen. Finally, exhausted and despairing, his mouth automatically opened. He couldn't help it. He breathed in. Chapter 3. The water penetrated his lungs deeply. He could feel its liquid coolness inside his chest, but for some reason he didn't cough, gag, or choke. He exhaled, and slightly warmer water flowed out of his mouth, accompanied by a fountain of bubbles. His feelings of panic and fear receded. He wasn't losing consciousness. He wasn't dying. He hung in the misty dark, confused. Experimentally, he filled his lungs and then breathed out. The water flowed in and out as naturally as air. Was he actually dying, and this was a projection of his fading mind? He didn't think so. After all, he and Arthur had been transmogrified into strange alien creatures only a few hours ago. Was he still a strange alien creature? He couldn't see a thing. He was either too deep or the water was too murky. He felt for one of his hands with the other. 4 fingers and a thumb. He was human again. Except not quite. Not unless you counted the ability to breathe water, which had never been a human capability, not naturally, nor even by design, as far as he was aware. Merlin had altered his body again, the same as he'd made him grey and hairless and given him a bulbous head and fully black eyes. What was the point of this new transformation? Where was he even? He swam a few strokes aimlessly. The direction of the surface didn't matter now. If he reached it, he didn't know if he would be able to breathe air. Was this a new task? And if so, what exactly did he have to do? Merlin was probably observing him right now and laughing at his bewilderment. Morgan, too. The only positive side to this new state of affairs was that he remained alive. No, there were 2 positive sides. If he was alive, so was Arthur. Was he around here somewhere? Without thinking, he tried to shout the king's name, but only a burst of warm water came out of his mouth, without a gurgle or a bubble. Speaking wouldn't work in this undersea realm. Could he find Arthur by touch? He reached out with his hands and feet, but encountered nothing. He thought back to his brief time in the sky, but he couldn't recall seeing what had happened to his companion. He swam some more slow, lazy strokes, not caring where he went, but needing to do something. The exhaustion of his long run through the city seemed to have entirely disappeared, as if when giving him the ability to breathe underwater, Merlin had also alleviated his fatigue. Or perhaps a long time had passed without him noticing and he'd recovered. According to what Merlin had told them and the challenge he'd set, they'd failed the first task. Was this the punishment? A burst of fear shot through him. Was this experience going to be never-ending? Was he to spend the rest of his life swimming alone in this abyss? But he couldn't believe it. He could not believe that Merlin, so bored with his own existence that he engineered strife and mayhem on a whole planet just for his amusement, would pass up the opportunity to have some more fun. Sooner or later, something would happen. Silver flashed in the darkness. I thought so. Are you listening in on my mind, you nasty old goat? A shape was moving toward him, sliding through the water like an indolent ripple. It had to be reflecting light from somewhere. Patrin gazed in the direction he assumed was up, and then all around. A faint glow shone in the distance, a band of light resembling the Milky Way. "Patrin!" Though the voice sounded in his head and not his ears, he recognized it immediately. "Arthur? I've found you at last. I guessed it must be you. Merlin has altered us once more, but you are the only other thing I've encountered." "Where are you?" As Patrin asked the question, he knew the answer. The silver creature had swum closer and now floated in front of him. It was the largest eel he ever saw, except it was narrow and its scales shone like liquid mercury. The head was flat, with holes for ears, and it held a gaping, many-toothed mouth and shark eyes. "What do you mean, Merlin altered us?" He reached for his other hand, as he had before, only to feel a sinuous, muscular wave pass through him. His hands were gone. "Shit, I hate this. What's the point of morphing us into these different life forms? I have come to know Merlin well over the years. I believe nearly everything he does is for his amusement. I have to agree. What now? Ah, I hoped Merlin might have told you. I haven't seen him either." How to point when you don't have hands? "There's something over there." He nodded in the direction of the band of light. "Then let us investigate." Somehow, what would have been the movement of Patrin's legs was translated into moving in the undulating motion of a sea snake. He propelled himself with Arthur toward the light. Might it in fact be the Milky Way shining down through the water? But then he recalled he was far from Earth, and the band of stars might not shine in this sky. The Defiant had travelled a long way, slipping faster than light speed through dark paths of space-time. This planet could be closer to the core of the galaxy and part of that gleaming ribbon in Earth's night sky. But what grew clearer the closer he swam was not the glimmer of celestial bodies, but a fiery furnace, oozing lava, turning the water hazy with intense heat. Great gaseous gouts belched from a jagged wound in the ocean floor. Brilliant colours, red, orange, pink, purple and yellow, etched the edge of the fissure and spilled out onto rocks and sand. "I know this place," Arthur said, "and I cannot go there. I will not." The king turned and began to swim away. "Arthur, where are you going? What do you mean you know this place? How do you know where we are? There's no way you were here before." Patrin swam after him. Merlin must have sent them to the bottom of the ocean to perform the second task. He might not have revealed it yet, but that had to be the reason for their fish bodies. "Arthur, wait!" He caught up to the king and matched his speed. "Stop! Talk to me!" Arthur's swimming slowed. "You must know it too. Though you are from a different time than I, all humans know of it. But I don't. I really don't. I don't understand." "It is hell. How do you not recognize it? I do not wish to witness the eternal torment of human souls." "It's..." Patrin halted. The king swam on. "It isn't hell, Arthur. It can't be. We're on an alien planet." Patrin set off again. "I get what you mean, but hell is an idea in human religions. I don't know what that place is, but there's no way it's..." When his companion didn't respond, Patrin went on, "Please, we have to go there. If we don't try to complete this task, we might never go home. I'll never see my family again." "We have already failed a task. I don't think it makes any difference whether we attempt this one." "But still, what else can we do? Swim around underwater forever?" The sea creature that was Arthur slowed down and then turned in a smooth arc. "I will attempt the task so that you might see your mother and sister again, but I fear it will come to nothing." They returned to the gash in the ocean floor. The water around Patrin's body grew warmer the closer they swam. At some point it would grow unbearably hot and his skin would begin to cook. They couldn't go right up to the fault line. That was what it had to be. He'd learned about plate tectonics at school. This superheated crack had to be the line where two plates met. Either they were pulling apart or pushing together, and in the gap magma could leak out. So this planet was similar to Earth in that way? Or perhaps it was just a conjuring of Merlin or Morgan's mind. "There are beings!" Arthur exclaimed. "It is hell! I was right!" Patrin scanned the cleft. It was hard to see anything in the glare, but he caught sight of movement, There were creatures here, as Arthur had spotted. They were mottled brown, well camouflaged against the seabed they crawled over. Some kind of arthropod, they marched steadily toward the fault line, steadily and irrationally. Why would any life form choose to approach the deathly heat? Then he saw better what was happening and understood Arthur's deduction. The creatures were not choosing their fatal path, they were being driven along it by others of their kind, jabbing them with long steel needles. The torturers or executioners surrounded their victims, cutting off all avenues of escape. It did look like a scene from hell. Save them. The words had not been spoken inside Patrin's mind, they had arrived externally, echoing through the water. They were unmistakably Merlin's. Save the creatures who were about to die? How? Patrin asked. Predictably, no answer came. Arthur said, Another impossible task. I begin to wonder if we have been in hell ourselves all along. If so, there is no doubt I deserve it. I have committed enough sin in my life. But you are innocent, Patrin. That is why you succeeded in the joust. You are pure and noble of heart. You should not be here. Patrin didn't know what the king was talking about. It was hard to relate to someone who had lived thousands of years ago, and he was pretty sure it had been Mam distracting Merlin that had allowed him to win the joust, not his purity or nobility. I am here, though, so I want to try. Try we must. There is no alternative, and perhaps Carla Orr and her son may arrive soon to complicate our efforts. They swam closer, slipping through the water in unison. The heat began to grow uncomfortable. A burning, stinging sensation came from all over his body. Even his eyes hurt. The creatures holding the spikes had noticed them. As their gazes turned upward, their victims took their chance and tried to break through the ranks of stabbers. The line of marchers was breaking up. Maybe a distraction was all that was needed, and the captives would escape without further intervention. But then the torturers realized what was happening and pricked their escapees back into line. Trying to ignore his increasing discomfort, Patrin glided downward. The heat from the vent was becoming unbearable. He dove at a group of needle-wielding creatures, snapping at them threateningly. They aimed their weapons at him to fend him off. Arthur harried the opposite side of the line. He was even closer to the heat source. Patrin didn't know how he could stand it. A batch of prisoners broke free and scrabbled hastily over the ocean floor. Patrin continued to distract their captors, feinting left and striking right, the needle points barely missing him. Arthur was not faring so well. Liquid spurted from his side, blood, no doubt, but in the low light it looked black as oil. Patrin wanted to go to his aid, but if he left his position, the escapees would soon be rounded up again. Arthur, come here! I will protect you! I must fulfill the task. The task doesn't matter. We can do it together. His statements didn't make any sense, but avoiding the jabs and seeing Arthur wounded was confusing him. Come to my side. I must... Ah! A third wound opened in the king's side. Patrin abandoned his location. The alien creatures could go to hell as far as he was concerned. He would not allow Arthur to be hurt. Go back! You cannot save me! Perhaps through loss of blood or due to the pain from the scalding water, Arthur was sinking closer to his attackers. The prisoners they'd been herding to their deaths were fleeing, but they were ignored in favour of killing the great fish creature. Arthur! Go back! Leave, Patrin! The king's voice was growing quieter. You have completed the task. You have saved some of these strange beings. Leave. Go home to your family. No! He rushed forward. A sharp pain pulsed from his thigh. except it could not be his thigh. He'd been wounded.
Patrin,
Arthur's tone was solemn.
remember your oath.
The king reached the ocean floor. The stabbing creatures closed in. Patrin turned from the scene, unable to watch. As he did so, he caught sight of the prisoners he had freed. They hadn't run away. They had returned and were attacking the jabbers, grappling with them and tearing the spikes from their claws. As soon as they were armed, they poked their former executioners, driving the needle tips into joints and eyes, forcing them closer to a fiery death. The tables had turned. The condemned had become slayers. Nothing had changed. His effort had been useless, and Arthur was dead. Chapter 4. Cool air bathed his skin, and the light was unbearably bright. Patrin shut his eyes. He was lying on a hard surface, cold and smooth like marble. If he was no longer in water, was he human again? Opening his eyes to a slit, he lifted a hand above his face. The familiar colour of his skin, the digits, the fine hair, the scuffed knuckles from the battle, all these things warmed his heart. But then a terrible memory struck. In his mind's eye he saw again the sea animal that had been Arthur, set upon by stabbing creatures. He squeezed his eyes shut, and tears escaped from beneath the lids. Arthur was gone. His mentor, his friend, the father he'd never had, his king, was dead. Gaping sorrow opened up in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by fury. Arthur's death had been Merlin's fault. If he hadn't set the tasks, if he'd just allowed everyone from the Defiant to leave, the King of the Britons would still be alive. He would not be a corpse lying at the bottom of the ocean, not even in his natural form. Patrin leapt to his feet. Wherever and whatever this new place was, he would seek Merlin out and kill him. "Now then," said a smooth voice, "be careful." Patrin spun around, trying to find the speaker. His eyes were gradually adjusting to the glare. A tall figure in a dark robe stood before him. His hands jerked out and grasped Merlin's neck.
"You killed him, you bastard!"
The neck collapsed beneath his fingers like a bath sponge. He half expected to see water or blood flow out, but nothing appeared, and Merlin only smiled condescendingly.
"Press away, young man, press away. The sensation is quite pleasant."
Patrin released his hold and clenched his fists impotently. He imagined smashing Merlin's face in, throwing him to the ground and stomping on his head, ripping out his entrails with his bare hands and stuffing them in his mouth. But the alien would not be harmed. His elastic body would only reform to its previous shape. Merlin's eyebrow lifted.
"You seem upset, Patrin. Tell me, what is it that angers you?" "Fuck off! I'm not telling you anything. You'll only feed off my emotions like the parasitic creep you are."
Another memory hit. He was on the battlefield again, and Merlin and Morgan were bargaining with Mam and Wright. One of the brothers from West Bi, the youngest one, who had been killed in the battle, walked out of a tent, alive.
"Bring him back to life! Bring Arthur back! I know you can do it!"
The corner of Merlin's lip lifted.
"What makes you think I have not?"
Huh? Could it be true? Patrin swiveled again. Arthur was lying only a few meters away, unconscious, but his chest rose and fell. Patrin ran to his side and collapsed to his knees, resting his hands on the broad chest to reassure himself that what he was seeing was real.
"What? No thanks? Not a word of gratitude?"
Merlin had moved silently closer.
"We did your tasks. You've played with us enough. Let us go. Send us back to Earth, you evil maniac." "Absolutely not." The terms of your stay here were not specified, and neither were the number of tasks you must undertake. You could be here a very long time. You were never interested in learning about humans, were you? You just wanted a couple of us on hand to torture for fits and giggles, right?
Patrin rose to his feet. He stood a head taller than Merlin. Making use of his additional height, he loomed over the slim alien, bringing his face so close their noses were almost touching.
You're disgusting and pathetic. Your life is so meaningless, so empty of love and friendship, so lacking in purpose. You have to torment other species just to give yourself a reason to carry on. You might look down on humans, but the poorest, weakest, most disadvantaged of us has a life full of more emotion and significance than yours is or will ever be. You're a waste of space, a blight, a void that only takes and never gives anything back.
Merlin's gaze was fixed on his, but his expression was inscrutable.
I don't care what you do with me. I don't even care what you do with Arthur. We've already lived more than you ever did or ever will. Kill me now. Kill us both. I'll die knowing that you didn't win. I've won because my mam, my sister, Arthur and TJ loved me. Who loves you, huh, Merlin? Who loves you?
Touching, Merlin murmured in his usual sarcastic tone. Yet Patrin was sure he detected a tremulous note, as if the alien was rattled. Had he really unnerved him? It was hard to believe. He'd only spoken from his heart, but as the word left his mouth, he'd known every one was true.
But,
the alien continued,
though you seem intent on dying, that was not part of my plan. A single task remains. Will you attempt it?
Somewhat deflated, Patrin replied,
Only one more. What is it? Look around. Can you guess?
The surroundings hadn't fully registered on Patrin. At first he'd been too blinded by the high-intensity light. Then he'd been too worried about Arthur and angry at Merlin. He broke eye contact with the alien and assessed this new place. The floor confirmed his first impression. It did appear to be made from a substance like marble. White, smooth, and faintly shiny, it spread in all directions until it reached. A white vapour obscured the farthest reaches of the floor. They were outside. The sky was entirely clear, and the sun was a brilliant orb, too bright to behold. The air was chilly, and it felt thin. It struck him that he couldn't see any other parts of the landscape. No hills or fields, no rivers or oceans.
Are we high up? Very high up. We are higher than the highest mountain on your planet. Naturally, I am helping you to breathe. That white stuff in the distance, those are clouds? Well spotted. Remember this. There are no barriers to prevent you falling, and nothing to indicate the edges of the platform.
Arthur groaned and lifted a hand to his head. Patrin moved to his side and squatted down.
How are you feeling? Are you okay?
The king opened bleary eyes and then quickly shut them again.
The light's bright here. You'll get used to it in a minute. Thank the stars you didn't die. Merlin will wait until he is fully ready before he kills me. Our most recent challenge was not the time. We only have one more task, then we can go home.
Arthur's eyes opened again and he sought Patrin's face.
Only one? What must we do?
Patrin turned to ask Merlin, but the platform was empty. The alien had vanished.
Damn, he's gone. He didn't say. Of course he didn't. Help me up.
When Arthur was standing, they surveyed the new place together.
We're up in the clouds and there's nothing to stop us from falling,
Patrin informed him.
So we have to be careful.
Arthur shrugged.
If Merlin wishes, he could catch us, or he could just let us fall. Exactly. Do you think that's the task, to avoid falling off? That seems too easy. Perhaps we must cast ourselves to our supposed deaths. Who knows? There is no telling.
They walked.
"I am glad I am in human form," said Arthur. "I did not enjoy being a fish." "Me neither." Patrin didn't ask him what it felt like to die. He didn't want to remind Arthur of the experience, or, in truth, to hear about it. He would find out one day himself, hopefully a very long time from now. "I saved some of those creatures, you know. I created a diversion so they could escape." "Well done. You succeeded in the task, and you may have saved our lives." "I don't think so. The creatures I saved didn't run away. They turned on their executioners. They stole their weapons and forced them into the fiery place instead." "So no good came from your intervention?" "None at all, as far as I could tell, except maybe the worse of the two types of creature died." "I don't understand it. But then, nothing here makes any sense. Who were the beings in the city? Why did Merlin set us the challenge to cross it in a day?" "The first task was impossible, and the second one was pointless." "I see something." Arthur pointed ahead. A tiered structure rose from a white base, like a small cone-shaped tower. Wreathed in mist, it was hard to make out. But then a breeze turned the vapor to threads, revealing a structure that held 6 seats. 3 made up the triangular base, 1 at each point. 2 seats were on opposite sides above, and a single seat formed the tip. The seats at the base and middle tiers faced outwards. The person sitting at the tip looked at them directly. It was Morgan Le Fay. She stood up, took a step forward, and floated to the floor. "Arthur, Patrin, how nice to see you. Have you been enjoying yourselves? Has Merlin shown you a good time?" She winked. "What am I saying? Of course he hasn't. He's far too dark and twisted." Patrin saw no reason to gratify her with a reply. Besides, he'd just recognized the people sitting in the middle tier seats. His gaze locked with Perrin awe, and then slid to his mother. After a brief discussion, they clambered down. Without Morgan's ability to gracefully float, they were forced to climb onto the backs of the seats below, disturbing their occupants, 2 grey-haired women and a grey-haired man. Perrin asked, "What was your second task?" "We're not here to compare notes," Patrin retorted. "What do you get if you win?" asked Carla. "Will you return to Earth?" "I'm returning to Earth anyway." He turned to Morgan. "That's what you promised, right? I want to go there now, with Arthur. My mam will be worried about me. You said I wouldn't be here long. You didn't say anything about these bullshit tasks and challenges." "You haven't been here long," Morgan replied slyly. "I want to go back with them," demanded Carla. "I?" Perrin glared at her. "Don't you mean we?" "Neither of you is going anywhere," Morgan snapped. "Except..." Her attention turned to the cloudy haze. One of the grey-haired figures at the base of the tower rose to her feet and hobbled toward them. "Who's that?" Patrin asked. "Who do you think?" Carla snapped. "Another one of them." The woman was ancient, looking as old as Arthur should have looked. Her head was little more than a skull, wispy strands of white hair clinging to it. Her white robe hung from her skeletal body like a funeral gown. Yet as she shuffled closer, she grew younger. Her hunched body straightened. Lustrous dark brown hair sprouted from her head and cascaded down her back, and her clouded eyes grew bright and vital. By the time she reached them, she resembled a woman only just out of adolescence, her skin plump and wrinkle-free. "You are the humans." She faced Arthur. "You are the oldest, though the time of your existence is equal to only a single exhalation of my kind." "I am the oldest," the king confirmed. "Who are you and your people? Why have you plagued my world?" Patrin had a sense of kindred spirits meeting for the first time. This new alien didn't regard Arthur with the same arrogance and haughtiness as Merlin and Morgan did.
She looked at him with an expression of respect. Patrin wasn't sure why. Perhaps she perceived the same things in Arthur that so many others did, that maybe Merlin had seen long ago. We visit many new worlds and new species. It adds interest to our lives. Who cares about that? Patrin snapped. What gives you the right to interfere in human affairs? What gives anyone the right to do anything? What are rights? Who decides them and upholds them? These questions have no answers. Believe me, we know. We have considered them for longer than your planet has existed. There is no meaning to life. There are no rights or wrongs. Everything is relative. If you believe that, why even bother going on? If there's no point to anything, why not kill yourselves? Do you think we have not tried? It was not the response Patrin was expecting. He'd anticipated some woolly reasoning, justifying their appalling behaviour. Arthur said, "Please, explain." "The explanation is simple. We cannot die. We do not grow old and wither as your species does. We can alter our forms, travel through the vacuum of space without protection, dive into stars and emerge unscathed. We can be exploded into atoms, but eventually the atoms will find each other, coalesce, and become whole again." "How long have you been like this?" Arthur asked. "There must have been a time you were mortal, like us." "Logically, there must, but it was so long ago we have no record of it. We do not even know the appearance or anatomy of our original form. At some point in our evolution, we must have discovered how to put a stop to aging. Then we learned how to shapeshift. Perhaps after that, perhaps before, we also devised a method for making ourselves indestructible. At the time, these medical developments must have seemed amazing, but there has been a bitter legacy." "Boredom," said Patrin, "and all that comes with it. Apathy, lethargy, indifference. We long to feel. We lust to care about something, anything. We desire deeply to believe that one thing holds more importance than another, as you do. But we cannot. We cannot care about anything any more." "Those grey creatures in the city," said Patrin. "Who were they? Have you trapped another life form here as well as us?" "The people in the city are my kind. I may have been one of them. That place is modelled on your planet. We sometimes go there to mimic the way you live, hoping to experience even a sliver of your feelings." "What about the life forms on the ocean floor?" Patrin pressed. "Don't tell me that was your species too." "Being forced to an agonized though brief death is one of the few ordeals that registers in our emotions." While they had been talking, Morgan stood by listlessly, looking disinterested. Occasionally she would throw a glance at Perrin and then beyond him to the cloudy expanse. Merlin stepped out of the mist. "Arthur, I see you have found your fellow humans." "Half humans," Morgan corrected. She placed an arm around Perrin's shoulder affectionately. He grimaced but did not remove it. "We have been learning about your people," Arthur replied to Merlin. "I must say, despite all the harm you have caused and the terrible deeds you have committed, pity for you stirs in my heart." "You pity me?" "He's right," Patrin said. "I pity you too, all of you. My life is rich, yours is empty. I would rather be human, even though my time is over in a blink of an eye in your terms, than endure the living hell of your existence." "What are you doing?" Perrin yelled. Morgan was wrestling one of his arms behind his back, evil delight wreathing her features. Though she was small and slight, she was surprisingly powerful. She easily completed her move.
Perrin was helpless, his face contorted with pain. She pushed him toward the edge. Shit, she's going to throw him off. Morgan was doing it for fun. She had clearly grown bored of the conversation and wanted a small diversion. If she did push Perrin over the edge, she could save his life regardless. But would she? Would Merlin or any of the others? They probably envied Perrin's ability to die. They would be jealous of the few seconds of intense feeling that would course through him as he fell to his demise. Patrin raced over to the struggling couple. He seized Morgan's hand and tried to peel it off Perrin's arm, but she was too strong. She grinned wickedly up at him. Perrin was only a meter from the drop-off. "Don't do it!" Patrin yelled. "He's terrified." He'd never liked Perrin. No one could grow up with Carla Orr as their mother and turn out normal, but the young man didn't deserve to be put through terror, not knowing if he was living his final moments. Morgan gave a grunt as she shoved Perrin away from her. He stumbled backward. She giggled like a child as, eyes round and mouth agape, he tumbled over the edge. Patrin leapt and reached out, blindly swiping through the air. His hand smacked into something solid, and he gripped it, fingers digging in for dear life. He'd caught Patrin's arm, but he couldn't hold on to the platform. The edge was smooth and curved. He slid forward on his belly, the weight of the other man dragging him down. The only way to save himself was to let go. He couldn't release his hold. In a split second he would be falling to the surface, along with Carla Orr's odious offspring. But then strong hands grasped his waist, halting his slide. "Not so fast, Patrin," said Arthur. "You are not going flying today. Your mother would never let me hear the end of it."
Chapter 5. From his standing position, Arthur had managed to gain traction on the platform with his feet, dragging Patrin and then Perrin to safety. Carla hugged her son, though listlessly. Morgan didn't even look contrite. Merlin gave his trademark smirk. The third alien didn't even seem to have registered the event. Her expression remained neutral. "Was that the last of the trials you set us, Merlin?" Patrin asked. "Were you in cahoots with Morgan, figuring out a prank to play? Wait, don't bother answering. I don't care. I demand you send me to Earth immediately. I thought it would be fun to learn about your planet and another intelligent species, but I hate it here. You're half crazy. What am I saying? You're fully crazy. You don't have anything to teach me. I want to go home." "Humans do not dictate our actions," Merlin retorted. "You listen and you obey. That is all. If you don't send me back, I'll just refuse to do anything. You won't get any more entertainment out of me. I could put an end to your life. At this very instant, I could remove the modification that allows you to survive in this rarefied atmosphere. You would asphyxiate in minutes. Then do it. I won't be your plaything any longer." Morgan pouted. "But your beloved mother would miss you so much if you never returned. She is missing you right now, you know." "Ma'am would understand. She wouldn't want me to give up my dignity and self-respect. She taught me my own worth. You're only saying that to manipulate me anyway. You want to feed off my despair like the parasite you are. Send me back to Earth, and Arthur too." "Patrin," the king said gently, "I am not sure I should return to our world, or that I want to." "What?" He stared into Arthur's eyes. The king was serious. "What do you mean? Of course you have to return to Earth with me. What else could you do?" But his friend's features remained grave, and for several moments he was silent. Dreams of going home to Westby Eye with Arthur melted in Patrin's mind. Images of the two of them riding through forests, of the king teaching him woodcraft, of listening to tales of olden times. Everything was fading like foam from waves on a beach.
"It seems to me," Arthur finally said, "that these creatures who have tortured humans for so long are also in torment. I would like to find a way to help them, if not for their own sake, then to prevent other peoples from enduring the experiences of humanity."
"Ha!" Merlin burst out.
"The arrogance!"
"I would like to hear what the oldest human has to say," said the nameless alien, her youthful brow wrinkling.
"I have learned much since I was awoken in this new age of humankind,"
Arthur explained.
"I have learned that the stars are hundreds of thousands of worlds existing in the night sky, and they are unimaginably old. I have also learned that many of these worlds may sustain intelligent living beings, like and yet unlike humans."
He turned his kind, patient eyes to the anonymous alien.
"It may be that somewhere among these worlds and civilizations lies the answer to your predicament. There could be beings even older than yourselves, creatures you have not yet encountered, who know how to give you the peace of a final ending. I propose that Merlin and I travel the stars to look for this answer. I yearn to see the miracles awaiting within the great expanse, and the strange people who live within it."
Arthur faced Merlin.
"What do you say, old friend? I care not for the final task you had in mind for us, but we had many exciting and daring adventures together once. Perhaps, over time, we can recapture the engagement and camaraderie of those moments. Perhaps one day you may even look upon me as your equal. I am willing to devote my life to this quest."
"But Arthur," Patrin pleaded, unwilling to let go of this man he'd grown to love.
"You're a Briton. We need you. Our country is at peace and will hopefully be so for a long time to come. It will hurt me sorely for us to part. But you have a family awaiting you, and eventually children of your own. Your world is familiar to you. It is your home, but it is not my home. My world faded from existence long ago and will never return. Therefore, I would like to seek out a new life and a worthy cause. This one, which has presented itself by many circuitous, meandering paths, seems fated to be mine."
"You can't!" Patrin thrust the heels of his hands into his eyes and his chest tightened.
"I'll miss you if you go,"
he murmured, struggling to stay in control of his emotions.
"And I will miss you too, deeply. Delight in the sweet sorrow, my friend. These poor creatures cannot feel it, nor any of the other emotions that make us what we are."
Morgan had wandered away, as if disinterested. The nameless alien said, "I have no objection to your scheme. Though we have searched long for an escape from our fate, the galaxy is vast. An answer may exist somewhere out there in the expanse of space." A pause fell. Patrin's heart seemed to cease beating. He was on the verge of being torn from and at the same time returned to the people he loved. Carla Orr took her chance. One eye on Morgan, who stood at a little distance, gazing out into the mist. She whispered to Merlin fiercely and jabbed a finger at Patrin.
"If you're returning him to Earth, send me and Perrin too."
"No!" Morgan had overheard. She came striding back. "These two are mine, and I'm keeping them." She glared at Carla. "You're staying here, you ungrateful bitch. You begged me to let you stay, and that's what's happening."
"I thought I was going to die with the rest of them. The situation's different now. I've changed my mind."
"Well, I haven't. If Earth is off limits, I need something to amuse myself with, and you and your precious son are it." Carla clenched her fists and appeared about to slap Morgan. The scene was descending into chaos. Who knew what stunt Morgan would pull next? Patrin swallowed.
"Arthur, if that's what you want to do, you must do it. but I have to go home to Mam and Kayla." "I understand. Merlin, give me your answer. Will you journey with me through the galaxy, seeking an end to your people's torment? And if your answer is yes, will you transport this young man back to his family?"
Merlin lifted a knuckle to his lips, and his dark-eyed gaze flicked between Patrin and Arthur.
"I suppose I don't have anything to lose."
He lifted a hand.
"Wait!"
Patrin exclaimed. This was it. There wasn't even going to be time to say goodbye. Merlin hooded his eyes.
"It's now or never, young man." "No!"
Carla spat.
"Me too! Send me back too!"
She gripped Patrin's arm, as if she might be dragged back to Earth with him. He peeled her hand off, pushed her away, and grabbed Arthur into a hug, saying thickly,
"I was honoured to know you, my king, and I you, my faithful squire,"
Arthur replied, grasping him tightly.
"Tell the Britons, if they need me again, I will return."
"Say hi to Talon for me," Morgan snickered. She was holding on to Carla by her hair. "If she's still around." Patrin took a breath. The light had changed. Cool, moist air, rich with woodland scents, hit him. Deep green grass stood beneath his feet, and trees rose to the sky. Merlin had transported him. He was on Earth. He could have been in any temperate forest, but he knew this was Westby Eye. He could feel it. He was home. The end. This has been Upshot, Star Legend Book 7, written and narrated by J.J. Green. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.